All right, welcome to Capturing Christianity. We are live, and I've got Jacob and Joe with me today, and we're sort of rehashing or discussing the recent debate that these two did live. And we were live in person all together, and now we're all, separated by hundreds of miles. But nevertheless, I think this discussion today should be very fruitful. Okay, so we're going to clarify some things that happened in the debate, and maybe see some sparks fly as they kind of go back at it a little bit. Ooh, who knows? We'll see what happens through the course of today's show. But hopefully there will be a lot of value in this. We're going to learn some things, see how arguments can be formed and how they should be formulated, and just talk about debate in general. I think it's going to be a good time. But Joe and Jacob, welcome back.
Thanks, Cameron. Great to be back.
Cool. So let's start with Jacob. So Jacob has some things that he wanted to sort of say first. He's even got some slides prepared and stuff. So Jacob, feel free to take it in whatever direction that you'd like, and then we'll get Joe to jump in, and we'll just have a good conversation.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to you guys for doing the debate, for coming to Utah. It was great to hang out with you guys. I think everything went wonderful in that aspect. And I also want to apologize profusely for the audio issues. I also think everyone needs to recognize that Cameron is a wizard. He was like, those audio files that he had to fix up were not as good as that final product that he put together. And so he gets all the credit for doing that. I was honestly so embarrassed and felt horrible that had to happen. But I think everyone owes you, Cameron, a big thank you for making it at least intelligible. And I apologize to you, Joe. I wish it would have been my audio would have been bad. So it would have, because I know there may be people out there thinking that I wanted this to happen or something, but no. So I just wanted to, first of all, just apologize to everyone for that. So want to get that out of the way.
You're forgiven. You're forgiven. These things happen. Right. They happen. I mean, I was there with the videographer at In-N-Out, and dude, I viscerally felt his disappointment and his the stress of just oh no, it's not here. He's he copied some files over, and he was not the right size and stuff, and he's that's not right. And I was just dude, I feel this right now because it's happened to me before. Yeah, nothing intentional. These things just happen.
I think anyone who's ever streamed or recorded, well, especially pre-recording, live streaming, you can usually find out right away. And speaking of which, if anybody is having trouble hearing my audio, let me know. But I've had times where I've recorded a long episode of Shameless Popery, and it's literally a 90-minute episode. Got to the end, went to export the files, and realized one of them, I just forgot to push record because I'd started and stopped and then forgot to start again. And it seems like that's exactly what happened here. I mean, the mic check. And then, okay, well, we don't need it right now, so we'll turn it off, and then forgot to turn it back on again. And I've done it. So, and absolutely no hard feelings. It's one of those things where it's frustrating, but it's like being mad at a storm.
And another thing reason I thought this would be a good conversation to have after the fact is because in a debate, you have limited time, and it can oftentimes be hard to get everything out that you need to. And at the end of the day, I'm interested in the truth here. I think we should make sure we understand where each other were coming from. Now, the last one was sort of this idea of if I was being shady or dishonest or something in the way that I approached this debate. And I wanted to, if I could, take a little time to sort of defend myself in a way, or at least say this. I want people to understand why I took the approach that I took in the debate. Whether they agree or disagree with that approach, that's fine. But I'm hoping that when people see why I went the direction that I went in the debate, they'll understand that I wasn't it wasn't in bad faith. It was, it had a lot to do with the way that I understood what the topic of the debate was and what the best strategy would be to approach that. So if it's cool with you guys, I have a few slides I was going to go through that I think will kind of make that.
Do we need to introduce it at all, or do we assume everybody here is familiar with everything we're talking about?
First of all, let me tell anyone who's watching to hit the like button. YouTube really likes it when you hit the like button, and if you're watching this, good chance you actually are enjoying this conversation. So hit the like button. But we can introduce it really quickly. So they debated recently on the Great Apostasy, which, this is the actual debate prompt that's on the screen right now. Are there good reasons to believe LDS claims about a great apostasy? So that's what they debated. And Yeah, I mean, is there really anything else to
I
say?
think
no, I
we've
think
already Jacob's already.
that's where I was going to go with it.
Yeah, I'll let you take it. I'll let you take it from
So,
here.
so I was going to start by just kind of explaining so I'm looking at this question as a Latter-day Saint. Obviously, I'm taking the affirmative position that there are good reasons to believe LDS claims about a great apostasy. And for me, and I mean this quite sincerely, the strongest reasons that I believe this are history, right? I think the historical nature of Christian history shows that the LDS claims about a great apostasy are true. But I think, and this is, I think, where the big part comes down to is, what is the great apostasy? So when Latter-day Saints talk about a great apostasy, this is what we have in mind. It's this idea that there used to be, in the time of when Jesus was on the earth, he built this church and he founded it on Peter with this central, ultimate, divinely guided authority, right? But that central, ultimate authority didn't continue after Peter, okay? And that as a result, there was schism and doctrinal drift over the course of history. So there is, and it's a little tricky because it's this historical narrative about what has happened in Christian ecclesiastical history. And there is sort of a one-time event, right, that happens with the loss of the central authority. But then we believe that the second part of it, the inevitable schism and doctrinal drift, that's something that happens over time. And the reason Catholicism, and specifically the Papacy, comes into view for Latter-day Saints as so central to this is because of the keys that were given to Peter. So
before we move forward, can you back up to the slide before? And I want to bring Joe in and just give any thoughts that he has on this, like just sort of definition of the great apostasy.
Yeah. So I think this is part of the LDS claim, but it is not the entire LDS claim about great apostasy. So if I can quote from Gospel Principles, the official LDS Church handbook, one of the things it says is because of wickedness and apostasy, the apostolic authority and priesthood keys were also taken from the earth. The organization that Jesus Christ had established no longer existed and confusion resulted. So they don't define the apostasy as either the later doctrinal drift alleged or the loss of priesthood and keys. They rather say as a result of the apostasy, that's why the keys were lost. That's why the priesthood is lost. So I'm curious where you're getting kind of are you giving some kind of official definition, or is this more your own read of what you consider the apostasy to be?
So I would definitely say that this is my understanding of the apostasy from my perspective as a Latter-day Saint who's been in the church my entire life, because it does come down to, and I think this next slide kind of shows it, it comes down to this idea of priesthood keys. Okay.
Well, so I agree with you about the importance of the priesthood keys, but I just want to make sure we understand, because you said throughout that we were not debating whether there were like a body of faithful believers, right? Like in the debate, you said we're not debating that. Mm-hmm. But in Gospel Topics, when it talks about what they mean by apostasy, they say when individuals or groups of people turn away from the principles of the gospel, they're in a state of apostasy. So they don't define it chiefly or originally as a loss of institutional integrity in terms of losing the ordinances or the priesthood or the keys or anything like that. Rather, they say after the death of the Savior and his apostles, men corrupted the principles of the gospel and made unauthorized changes in church organization and priesthood ordinances. Because of this widespread apostasy, the Lord withdrew the authority of the priesthood from the earth. So what you're seemingly defining as the great apostasy, they would define as the symptom of it. I think that is going to be important for a lot of reasons, but it'd be kind of like if you define death as like when you bury a person. It's like, no, that's an effect. That's not what the thing is itself. Because they're saying that there is a universal apostasy, which they've defined as a turning away from the principles of the gospel. So if we don't see a universal turning away of the principles of the gospel, we don't see a universal apostasy as defined by your church. Even if you could say there's a loss of institutional continuity in some other way. And so, to use the obvious example, Protestants believe in a loss of institutional continuity. They don't automatically, I think they often do in practice, but they don't automatically believe that all faithful believers or groups of people turned away from the principles of the gospel. Like those are two different claims, and all of the official LDS literature I'm seeing makes one claim, which then gives rise to the institutional claims. And it sounds like you're defining it differently. So I'm kind of curious why.
So I would say this, that it's kind of both. Okay, because I would say that the reason that the Lord doesn't restore this central authority and continue to keep it going is because there is a rejection of the Lord's prophets. In the early church, you can see that there is already issues with people turning away from the gospel. Peter or Paul, for example, is wondering why are people, if you look at the letters themselves, and I tried to point this out, the letters are largely written in response to sort of creeping apostasy and issues within the church itself.
Okay, so just to clarify, I definitely want to give you a chance to do this. I just want to make sure we have our terms straight, because you're using the term apostasy again, and you've sort of tied it to the death of Peter, if I'm not mistaken here. Is that right?
Yeah, but
so we're talking
I'm
something
saying,
pre-64.
What I'm saying is that it's all sort of wrapped together into one thing. The apostasy isn't one event in history. Apostasy as a general term is the idea that there is a turning away from the principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the breaking away from what this original institution was, and schism and doctrinal drift. Now, within the early church, there already were issues, even during the time of the apostles, with apostasy. Okay. And eventually the apostles are killed. And so that sort of cancer that had begun now is basically unchecked and continues to grow. So I don't think that I would say, though, that the exact timing of exactly when the apostasy, quote unquote, happened, the great apostasy overall, as the church teaches it, is a narrative about what happened when the priesthood authority was ultimately taken from the earth, and what we see as a result in schism and doctrinal drift.
Okay, and when do you think the priesthood authority was taken from the earth? Like with the death of Peter, or with the death of John, or some other time?
I would say with the ultimately with the death of the final apostle. Well, I would say with the death of Peter is when the ultimate central authority was lost.
Okay, so there's already an apostasy.
Hold on. Let me actually back up.
Sorry,
I think that, let me clarify. I would say with the death of the last apostle, all apostles held that universal jurisdiction, but only Peter held sort of the presidency of the apostleship, the one who gets to kind of be the ultimate decision maker if there was division amongst apostolic sort of office holders, let's say.
So you think it's that kind of tie-breaking authority? Maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a better term. This Patron authority is lost around 64, but that's not apostasy yet. It happens later when John dies.
Yeah, I would say that the fullness of the apostolic keys was lost at that time. So what the exact timing of it and exactly how it all shook out, that's one thing. The more important thing is the result that ultimately comes from it. Because when you don't have this ultimate authority, and actually, Cameron, would you be willing to put the slides up back on the screen? So here is the reason. I want people to, again, when this happened and exactly how it happened, we can debate that. But I want to point out like why I went towards the papacy in this, okay? Because what Latter-day Saints believe is that Peter held certain keys, okay? And those keys gave him sort of this ultimate central authority where he was divinely guided to direct the church, okay? As you can see, President Nelson, the president of our church who recently passed away, his hands are on the keys that are being held by Peter. Now, if we notice the papacy and its coat of arms, it has keys, specifically because it claims to hold Peter's keys. And so the reality is that if the papacy is true, then there was no great apostasy. At a very minimum, like I have to show that the papacy is not true if I want to show that there was no great apostasy. So I hope people understand why I went the direction I did going after the papacy, because these are two competing claims that ultimately, let me go up here, that ultimately are incompatible. Either the keys of Peter still reside within the Catholic institution and have since the very beginning, or else they were lost and in need of some kind of a restoration. So I hope that's clear why I went the direction of the papacy. Does that make sense?
I have thoughts on this. Do you want me to jump in? Or you want me to save them for after you get a little more? Because I think this okay. It seems like you're denying the antecedent. Like, if the papacy is true, therefore there was no great apostasy. The papacy, if the papacy is true, then no great apostasy. Papacy not true, therefore great apostasy. But that's logically fallacious. I mean,
actually, let me show you, because you are correct, and I'm not claiming that. Well,
okay. Maybe I can hold that thought for later if you're going to kind of spell this out more.
If the papacy is the only game in town for disproving the great apostasy, as I've defined it, then it would be true. It wouldn't be a denying the antecedent. For example, but this is and I want to show you this real quick. Let me come down here to Cameron, if you want to go to this. So this is the way I viewed the debate, and whether people agree with it or disagree with it, this is the way that I look at it. I do have a burden of proof. My burden is to show that there was a loss of this central authority that ultimately resulted in schism and doctrinal drift over the centuries. And the way I saw it is, okay, well, then Joe's burden is to show that there was no loss of central authority or doctrinal drift, which is the claim of the Catholic Church. They say that the central authority was held by Peter throughout time, and that they've perfectly preserved the apostolic doctrines of the early church. And so I want to show why this matters so much, and why I don't think there's any other game in town except for the Catholic Church. Like, I actually want to, as funny as it may sound, like, I want to strengthen the Catholic claims here. Like, don't undersell Catholicism. Catholicism is saying that they have an ultimate authority. And so I'm going to kind of like the Pope, right? And then below him are these bishops who have these different churches. But ultimately, the bishops are subject to the Pope. And what this does is that when there is schism, it's very easy to tell here, well, you need to stick with the Pope and the institutional church, because he holds that unifying factor that holds everything together. This I wouldn't even call schism technically. I would call this apostasy, because as you've pointed out in your videos, Joe, they're breaking away from the church, right? They're breaking away from something.
Well, but if you have what schism is, but yeah.
Well, just as I refer to it today,
go ahead. Sure.
I'm making a distinction between a schism and an apostasy. In this case, this is someone breaking away from the church, the true church. And so in my mind, they would be in an apostate state, right? Because they've broken, it's apostasy, right? It's to stand apart from something. They're standing apart from the institution. Now,
sorry, just to make sure I understand, what would be a schism in this system?
I'll show it right here in the next one.
Okay, cool.
Let me show you in this next slide. So under an equalized structure, so this is where everyone has equal authority, right? All of the bishops, there's no bishop of bishops, as St. Cyprian said. This is more like what the Orthodox have. There is no ultimate central authority. There are a group of equals. You in your book talked about the Eastern Orthodox Church as almost like an aristocracy, government by a few rather than a government by one, a monarchy, which is what I was talking about within the papacy. Now, when there is disagreement amongst equals, now you have a very different situation, because when equals begin to divide, this is what I would consider schism. Okay. You're breaking apart the institution. But the thing is there's no one that can kind of claim, well, but we're the ultimate authority. You have to stick with us in virtue of our authority. Instead, you have equals in authority saying, well, I have the true gospel. I have the true gospel. And each one of these people, you can, in Protestantism, you go down to where literally every single person has equal authority. And therefore it's like anyone can start a church, but it's kind of the same sort of problem. So the way I see it is just from the Catholic perspective. Again, in your book, you say denominationalism is the natural result of a democratic church. There is in Orthodoxy no one with an equivalent position to the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. The result is a decentralized system of independent local churches without the leadership of a shepherd. We are prone to contentious disputations. Even today, there is still no official consensus within Orthodoxy as to which books even belong in the Bible. Now, I read that and I thought, that's brilliant, Joe. Like, I agree. That's why I think the Catholic claims are so strong because they have a centralized authority structure that holds everything together. So in my mind, and this will be my last thing, I'll wrap up. In my mind, it's sort of like, well, either we have this centralized authority structure that holds everything together, and that centralized authority has existed since the beginning, as the Roman Catholic Church claims, or else it didn't. And the result was schism and doctrinal drift, which is what you would predict when you lose that ultimate authority that holds everything together. Anyway, those are my slides. That's kind of my thoughts.
I appreciate that. I do think that's helpful. It does still seem to be obviously logically fallacious. Maybe I could illustrate it like this. Like, let's say an atheist reached out to you and said, Jacob, I would love to debate you on atheism because I can prove atheism to you. I'll be the affirmative. I'm going to prove that there is no God. And then you go to the debate, and whatever the atheist version of Utah is, I guess California. I'm just kidding. California. My wife's from California. I'm just please don't be mad at me. You go there, and then this atheist, whoever, gets up, Dawkins will say, and says, in this debate, Jacob has to prove to you that all the claims of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are true, and that you should all become Mormon, and if not, I'm going to win the debate. Now, they could defend that afterwards by saying, well, if Mormonism is true, then atheism is false. They're obviously mutually exclusive claims, and that would be true. But I think we would all recognize, like, well, no, that atheist has clearly changed both the topic, atheism to Mormonism, and the burden, affirmative to negative. And that those are both illegitimate moves, even if there's a certain sense in which you could say, well, if Jacob had come out and made this amazing case for Mormonism, that would disprove the atheist claim, but disproving Mormonism doesn't prove atheism. So neither would you attacking Catholicism disprove Catholicism, unless we also have a kind of extended conversation about the need for, and you have done some of that work here, unless you can then also disprove Orthodoxy, Protestantism along some similar grounds. But in terms of like the actual debate itself, you announced to the crowd that it was my job to do that, of disproving the Orthodox and the Protestant claims. When if Orthodoxy or Protestantism are true, that would certainly Orthodoxy, that would disprove great apostasy. If Orthodoxy is true, that would not disprove the negative on that resolution, right? Like your opening line, and I've got it in front of me, is Joe is here to claim that the Pope has always sat in the chair of Peter, and therefore all believers in Christ, including Protestants and Orthodox, must submit to the infallible dictates of the Pope. Now, I think that the papacy is true, just like you think Mormonism is true. But still, if either of us was debating an atheist, we wouldn't say we're going to prove our particular form of theism to be correct, I assume. Well, we might also believe that, but it's downstream, right? Or are you saying you would?
Well. Again, I would go back to the fact that I actually believe the Catholic claims that Orthodoxy is incomplete and Protestantism is also incomplete, that they don't have the fullness of the institutional church.
Well, let's say this hypothetical atheist agrees with you that a great apostasy would have happened if theism was true, and that they think Mormonism is the most likely form of theism. And so therefore
Mormonism, I unless they could prove that Mormonism was the only possible theistic system that could exist, then
right. So they couldn't just put that burden on you.
What I'm saying is
I actually you have to prove that.
I actually think there are other theistic systems that can exist outside of Mormonism. But what I'm saying is I don't believe that there are other churches that can claim to be the original church for the very reasons that Catholics bring up. I think Catholics make a very compelling case. And so I was expecting that you would come from this, from the angle of a Catholic, saying the only true church is the Catholic Church. And so if the Catholic Church is not true, then that would imply something like a great apostasy, because no other church can claim to go all the way back to Peter holding this sort of central and ultimate adjudicating authority.
So, yeah, you're familiar with arguments a fortiori, like basically in a hierarchy of truth, the case for theism is going to be at least as high, if not higher, than the case for Christianity. It can't logically be lower. And similarly, the case for Catholicism is going to be at least as high, if not higher, than, or excuse me, the case for Christianity is going to be at least as high, if not higher, than the case for Catholicism, because you can logically affirm the one without affirming the other. In terms of the higher order stuff, you can affirm without affirming the lower order stuff. And so similarly, believing that Daniel 2 foretells that the church founded by Jesus Christ won't go into an apostasy. All I need to prove is that case. And then we can ask the lower question of, okay, well, which church is the church foretold in Daniel 2? Like, we know it's the church that starts in the 1st century. And then I think all of your arguments are very good. Once we see that great apostasy isn't an option, what church plausibly could be the one described in Daniel 2? And I think...
Well,
go ahead.
Real quick, Cameron, if you actually want to put, there's a slide on here that I skipped because it wasn't relevant, but now it's relevant, I think. And that is when we talk about the church, right? I don't believe that the institution as a body of believers ever ceased to exist. The great apostasy is a commentary on the institution that governs those believers. Like so when you say that the church never went into apostasy, I would say, yeah, the body of believers never was completely gone from the earth. But I would say that the institution that governs those believers, just based on the history, doesn't have a continual existence.
So when you say body of believers, do you mean that in the Protestant way or the LDS way? I mean, that seems obvious, but the LDS, again, the LDS website says, what is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was restored by God in our day through the prophet Joseph Smith. The Church of Jesus Christ is an organized body of believers who've taken upon themselves the name of Jesus Christ by baptism and confirmation. Now, if this is a restored body of believers, that does sound like they're saying the body of believers was lost. Individual faithful may have continued, but a body of believers as an organized body is part of the LDS claim of apostasy. And so you are seemingly at loggerheads with your own church on whether or not the body of believers is lost.
So first of all, I would point to Doctrine and Covenants, section 10, which is this is prior to Joseph ever restoring anything in the church. Okay. The church doesn't exist in 1828 when he receives this revelation. And he says, this is what the revelation says. It says, I bring this part of my gospel to the knowledge of my people. Okay, so he's talking about God having a people prior to the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He says, behold, I do not bring it to destroy that which they, his people, have received, but to build it up. I do not say this to destroy my church, but I say this to build up my church. So what Jesus is literally referring in our Doctrine and Covenants to a church existing before the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it seems very clear that the word church in LDS scriptures and in the Bible can be used in two senses at least, either to the body of believers or to the institution that governs those believers, or it can refer to both of them together. Sort of the fullness of the church is the body of believers being governed by the institution that was founded by Jesus.
Okay, I may be just completely misunderstanding your point there, but in Doctrines and Covenants 10, it says, if this generation harden not their heart, I will establish my church among them. Now, I do not say this to destroy my church, but I say this to build up my church. Therefore, whosoever belongeth to my church need not fear, for such shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. That seems to refer specifically to a future event. And then it says, but it is they who do not fear me, neither keep my commandments, but build up churches unto themselves to get gain, yea. And then I think from other contexts, that seems to be a description of every Protestant denomination and the Catholic Church based on other things Joseph Smith said, where, you know, the creeds are all abominations and, you know, God had revealed that none of them are following gospel principles and so on. So it sounds like he is specifically saying there is a people in some sense of people trying to follow after him, but not a church. Is that wrong?
Well, why would he? So if Jesus is trying to establish his church again in its fullness, he's talking about his people, okay, the body of believers. In the Book of Mormon, it even talks about, it says that there are saved two churches only, the Church of the Lamb and the other is the Church of the Devil. Are there only two churches in the world? Obviously not.
Depends what we mean by church. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly my point. The
Right.
point is that it's very clear in LDS scriptures that the word church can be used in different senses, just as it can be used in different senses within the Bible. The word church can refer to the faithful seekers, the body of believers, as the church in the sense of those who aren't even part of the institutional church. Okay, those in other denominations talk about sort of like the invisible church. We believe in that same concept in the people as a body of believers. But then there is this notion of the institution that governs those believers. That's another sense in which the church is used. It's used that way in the New Testament. And I believe that those two things together can also be referred to as the church. It's sort of the fullness of the church when you have both those together. So when we talk about the great apostasy, we're not saying that there was no body of believers. The entire great apostasy narrative is ultimately about the institutional church and what happened to that in history, and the fact that it doesn't have a continual existence. And I would posit this, and this is why I wouldn't say that I'm denying the antecedent here. Okay. I'm saying the only other reasonable option out there for an institution that goes all the way back to Peter, that holds his same authority and keys, the only one I know that even claims to hold those kind of keys is the Catholic Church. And so the apostasy is fundamentally about the loss of that and the results of what happens when that sort of authority is lost.
Let's talk about that a little bit, if we may, because I think that we might be over exaggerating the similarities between what we mean by the keys. Like, we would say the keys are to bind and loosen, so it's a doctrinal authority, not an authority to receive new revelation, or it's the keys to the kingdom of heaven, but it's tied to the binding and loosening authority. Let me be more precise there. Excuse me. So we would say there is this Petron authority with the keys, but this is not about the ability to receive new doctrine. So we specifically don't claim that Peter is, that Leo is an apostle in the way that Peter was an apostle. Nor do we claim.
So you don't claim that he has the same sort of authority that Peter had.
Correct. It depends on what we mean by authority. There are some things where we don't claim that he is an apostle in the same sense. And so in that sense, it does seem like maybe some of the debate is just premised off maybe not understanding what the Catholic claims are, because we use similar language, but we mean different things by it.
Well, if Latter-day Saints believe that you have an apostasy when you lose the fullness of the authority that was held by Peter, then wouldn't that be almost like an admission to an apostasy by our definition? If that authority is
precisely like, if you're right about what constitutes an apostasy biblically, then it would just be when the 12 apostles die, like definitionally, because as a matter of history, nobody's out there claiming that the 12 apostles appointed anyone else as apostles. And they clearly don't. We see with the death of James in, Acts 12, between the year 40 and 44, he dies and is not replaced. And there's no attempt to replace him. The only one who gets replaced is Judas, and we're told why. And we're told the only people who can replace him are those who've accompanied Jesus from the time of his baptism. So it's literally impossible for anyone to meet those criteria afterwards. So all of that is laid out in the New Testament itself. This is no surprise. No one is shocked when they don't replace anyone else. Luke 22 talks about the 12 sitting on 12 thrones in heaven. So there is a cap of 12 saved apostles in this sense of apostle. The word apostle, one who's sent, is used in other ways. So like Jesus is described as an apostle, Paul is described as an apostle, but in the specific sense of the 12. And 1 Corinthians 15 distinguishes this. If you want to see in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about how he appeared to Cephas, Peter, then to the 12, that's verse 5. But then he talks about how he appeared to all the apostles in verse 7. So clearly the 12 are distinguished from other apostles. The 12 are a specific, unique historical event that isn't replicated. And so if the claim is just the assertion that you have an apostasy when those 12 people die, then you have to do more to show they weren't intended to only be 12 people. They were intended to continue on forever. And so I addressed this somewhat in the debate, but I think we were sort of talking past each other. Because I think you thought that we thought that the Pope is like another apostle.
No. And I what I would say, though, is that ultimately what the Catholic, there is some debate, I think, between us on the nature and need for revelation from God and what that looks like. I mean, ultimately, you believe that the Pope is divinely guided in protecting the doctrines of the church, and that he won't make an infallible claim, that he's infallible in his teaching office, right? And if that isn't ultimately a form of divine guidance, I agree it's not necessarily...
We're open to the idea of divine guidance, but we would say divine guidance and being one of the 12 are two different things.
Well, and I don't think that there's anything logically incoherent about the notion of saying that, well, God isn't going to reveal anything new, but he is going to divinely guide us in such a way that we won't make any errors. Okay, I think that's perfectly fine. You can say that is the type of central authority that you can put your trust in to avoid all the issues of what happens when that authority doesn't exist. And so even if that, like, I'll just grant that. Let me just grant the Catholic position that, like, okay, then fine. If that was the case, then it wouldn't be an apostasy, because you'd have a teaching office that you could rely on to preserve the doctrines of the church throughout history. My issue, and what I tried to point out in the debate, was that historically that just doesn't exist. And so if you don't have that sort of a central ultimate authority to hold things together, kind of like what I had pointed out in the slides, what results is what you see in Eastern Orthodoxy. You don't have the fullness of the church. You get schism, you get doctrinal drift, and Protestantism being an even fuller expression of what happens when you don't have a central authority. So I'm making the case historically that you will get an apostasy without a divinely guided central authority, whether that's the Pope in kind of your guys' version of it, or a prophet in our version of it. You need to have that central authority in order to avoid schism and doctrinal drift. And again, this is why it's not denying the antecedent. I don't see any other institution that can make the claim except for the Catholics. And I think that one ultimately fails, but it's the only serious one that's really even made.
Again, though, it sounds like you're saying that the institutional, the loss of the institution is what leads to the apostasy. Whereas, again, everything I'm seeing from like church manuals, doctrines of the gospel, etc., seems to say the opposite, that the apostasy is the falling away from the church, or the falling away of the church, because they reject doctrines and ordinances. And that then leads to the loss of the institutional authority. And I think that matters, because if you're saying this happens in the mid 40s or in the mid 60s, or if you're saying it happens in the year 100,
well, I don't like to describe the apostasy as an event. Okay. Because the event, the loss of the keys, you could say, is an event, but the effects from the loss of those keys, apostasy means to, like, step away from. Well, when you lose the church and that central divine, like, if you didn't have the Pope, you would have over time an apostasy result where people would drift doctrinally and divide from one another, as we see in Eastern Orthodoxy and in Protestantism.
But there you have the loss of institution leading to the doctrinal problems, not the other way around.
Okay. Let me read what it says right here on the website, because I mean,
okay, yeah,
I
please.
think everything, just so you know, everyone, all the Latter-day Saints I know, no one was telling me that, like, my definition of apostasy isn't in line with, like, their understanding of it. Okay?
Oh, no, that's good to know. I've never been a Latter-day Saint. And so this could be one of those things where people who go to Catholic school have one idea of what the church teaches, and then the Vatican says something else.
So here's just on our website. I just looked it up randomly just to see what it says. It says, after the deaths of the Savior and his apostles, men corrupted the principles of the gospel and made unauthorized changes to church organization and priesthood ordinances. Okay? So it's describing the apostasy as something happening after the death of his apostles. Now, there was individual apostasy. You've pointed this out yourself in your own videos, and I think you do a good job of doing that. There was individual apostasy from the institution during the lifetime of the apostles. That's largely why the letters were written. Okay.
Can I press you on this? Because I think if that definition is correct, that is completely a defeater for your case.
Okay.
Because this says after the death of the Savior and his apostles. So step 1, the apostles die. Step 2, men corrupted the principles of the gospel and made unauthorized changes in organization and priesthood ordinances. Step 3, because of this widespread apostasy, the Lord withdrew the authority of the priesthood from the church. But your version is that the loss of the priesthood authority, or the keys, seems to be at the time of the apostles, which is why you don't have any replacement apostles. Like, those two versions of history can't both be true as far as I can tell, because they have the events happening in a complete reverse order. You're saying there's a loss of institutional authority, and that leads to the drifting from the principles of the gospel, right?
I would put it this way. So Hegesippus said, quote, "The church continued until then as a pure and uncorrupt virgin." So the church is basically echoing what Hegesippus, one of the earliest historians, writing 50 years after the death of the apostles. He says the church continued until then with the apostles as a pure and uncorrupt virgin. But when the sacred choir of apostles became extinct, then the combinations of impious error arose by the fraud and delusions of false teachers, as there were none of the apostles left. These also henceforth attempted without shame to preach their false doctrines against the gospel of truth. So what the apostasy is it's something that, as far as I can tell,
I don't think that's the quote. He says that there also were those who attempted without shame to preach their falsely so-called gnosis against the gospel of truth. Like, his argument is that after the time of the apostles, that the Gnostics begin to preach more boldly and are unsuccessful against the preservers of truth.
Well, no, certainly the Gnostics were part of the heresy that existed.
But he specifically talks about those with falsely so-called gnosis. That's the Gnostics. That's where the word Gnostic comes from.
The translation that I had says doctrine, but regardless of if it's the Gnostics or not, my point is that he's pointing out that the apostles were the ones that were the bulwark against the creeping apostasy of the church. Okay, so when you have apostasy that's entering the church, which is very clear, the 2nd century is full of heresy. There's all these problems with heresy, and in that time period, we would expect that everyone would go to Rome to be able to adjudicate the heresy, but no one does. Like, Rome is treated just as another bishop during those centuries.
I don't think that's historically true, but I want to actually focus on the other part, because I think that by using the version of wherever you got that version of Hegesippus's quote, it's not accurate. It doesn't talk about heretics coming in and creating an apostasy in the church. It talks about how the Gnostics became bolder after the death of the apostles, which, of course, because one of the Gnostics' big claims was that the apostles had a secret set of teachings. And if the apostles aren't alive to say, no, we don't, then of course they're going to be bolder.
Well, it wasn't just the Gnostics who said that there were secret
Hegesippus specifically is talking just about the Gnostics. And I think this matters, because we would agree that in both Mormonism and in Catholicism, you have heresies and falsehoods that arise, and the institutional church has to respond to them, right? And that doesn't of itself create any kind of apostasy.
But you have to recognize that even in the time of the apostles, they were predicting that there would be people within the church that would arise that were a problem. Jude says there are certain men who crept in, ungodly men.
Wouldn't we both agree that this is true of both of our institutions? That there are people preaching bad stuff in the name of Mormonism. There are people preaching bad stuff in the name of Catholicism.
And I think that goes back again. If we go to that slide, let me actually put this one back on the board. This is why the centralized church structure matters so much, because it is the centralized church structure that ultimately holds the whole thing together. So you don't end up with an equalized structure problem where everyone branches off following different equals who have different ideas. That's why I'm pointing out again in the debate that the big issue here is there a central ultimate authority in the early church, and does it continue? Now, people may disagree if that actually happened, but I want you to recognize, I hope we can all realize, I'm not being dishonest here. I'm
so
showing
just to clarify, if you were convinced that there was this shift in centralized authority, but there were no doctrinal changes, like let's say the Orthodox or whoever, they don't have a pope, but they managed to keep the faith remarkably intact for 2,000 years. I'm using them as an example. I'm not affirming that, but let's just take that. In your view, is that an apostasy?
So what you're saying here is that essentially in this sort of schism that happens within Eastern Orthodoxy, one of the branches of Orthodoxy, let's
just say they all continue to remain true to the principles of the gospel. Now, we might think that's an unlikely historical event to happen, but it seems like you are reducing the Mormon claims of apostasy to just the loss of institutional integrity. Whereas, for instance,
I just don't think I don't think in history what we see is the perfect preservation of that the doctrines. Like I see that the doctrines are clearly changing and evolving. And I'm also seeing that the central authority that existed that Peter held wasn't actually continuing in the Bishop of Rome. What existed after the death of the apostles was this. You had bishops who were all equals in authority, and then what happened over time was this. And then what the Roman Catholic Church is, it's one of these groups that then basically says, actually, we're not just one of the bishops like everyone else, like everyone always thought. We are actually the centralized structure. And everyone
it sounds like you're saying the Orthodox are right, and therefore there's a great apostasy. But I'm saying, doesn't that argument only work if you assume either there's automatically a definitional apostasy if you lose apostles, or that the Orthodox have demonstrably gone into this kind of like apostate level heresy in terms of drifting? Like, in other words, it doesn't seem like even by your own sort of way of defining great apostasy, you can just say you think that there's an institutional change.
Well, if someone wants to make the claim that one of the Orthodox groups actually has the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ and its institution, like, then someone can make that claim. I don't believe that claim. I actually believe that I think that what you have is a fundamental issue that is the central authority. With it being lost, it causes all these problems. So even if they were lucky enough to hold things together so that they held on to the doctrine really well, which is demonstrably false historically, I would definitely say that what you have here is still a lack of the fullness of the original institution. And I believe that.
Okay. So you would say,
I want to do something really quickly. So someone sent this the reformulation of your opening statement, your argument in your opening statement, Jacob. I want to just, for people that are just listening, I'm going to read it out loud. But then, Jacob, I want you to just, say whether or not this is sort of what you were getting at. I think this is actually pretty charitable. So premise 1, it is essential to the institution of the church that A, and there are 3 of these, there is a continuous universal authoritative head. B, the head possesses Peter apostolic keys authority. And C, the head can receive ongoing binding public revelation for the whole church. Premise 2, all essential features of the church existed when founded by Christ. Premise 3, if any essential feature is lost, the church itself becomes apostate. Premise 4, the Catholic Church lacks 1A and 1B because the papacy is not of apostolic origin. Premise 5, the Catholic Church admits it lacks 1C. 6, all other churches admit they lack 1A, B, or C. 7, if the previous premises are true, then there was a great apostasy, therefore there was a great apostasy. Is this more or less like your argument?
I think it's pretty good, actually. I would say overall, yes. I might change premise C to because I think Joe does make a good point when he says that, is there a need for ongoing binding public revelation for the whole world if you are ultimately have a divinely guided source that preserves the tradition throughout history? So I would just change C to like the head must be divinely guided in such a way that none of the binding doctrines are like lost, right? So the head must be divinely guided. I would use that sort of language because there is a presupposition that like new revelation is needed, but if the entire fullness was given at the time of Jesus Christ, then it's just a matter of preservation. But that would still require divine guidance.
Yeah, that would mean 5 is no longer true.
Well, 5, I mean, I suspect he doesn't think that the Catholic Church is divinely guided.
We would have to get into what we mean by divinely guided in each case.
5 would no longer apply.
Okay, I'll just delete it. So yeah, so the main thing that you argued was premise 4 now on the argument on the screen. The Catholic Church lacks 1A and 1B because the papacy is not of apostolic origin. So then I think the problem, and that what Joe is kind of getting at, is that there was multiple premises in this argument that you laid out, and you didn't defend all of them. Like you defended premise 4 principally, that the papacy is not of apostolic origin, which really only concerns the first 2 of the institution. And then the other problem is that like, when he wanted to say that it was sort of off topic or like, why are we just talking about the papacy? There's a lot of Christians that are going to deny premise 1. So you're going to have to provide, and you didn't really provide in your opening statement, so far as I can tell throughout the entire debate, you didn't really provide reasons. Now you have done that here, but you didn't really do it in the debate. You didn't defend premise one to the degree that I think would be necessary to make it clear that ruling out the papacy would prove any sort of great apostasy.
Yeah, and I would say that the reason I didn't is because there are time limits, and I'm arguing with a Catholic, and so I'm going to assume that the Catholic believes 1A and 1B, and that those are essential to the Catholic claims. So even if I
so again, like you imagine an atheist debating you and saying, well, look, we all know you're LDS, so if theism's true, you think LDS is true. So therefore, to prove atheism, I just have to disprove LDS. What would be the difference between that and what you're describing?
Well, because LDS don't claim that there's no other form of theism that is logically possible.
But I mean, we wouldn't say there's no other form of Christianity logically possible.
Yeah, but I would still say that there. So I would say that. Repeat that question again. I want to make sure.
So imagine like an atheist reaches out to you and says, "I can prove atheism is true," and then they get up and they just say, like, "It's Jacob's job today to prove to you that you need to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints," and he has to prove that to all the other theists in the crowd. And so you would, I think, regard that as switching both the topic and the burden of proof. Now he could respond, "Well, isn't that the form of theism that you believe in?" And you would be like, "Well, yeah, of course." But it sounds like you're regarding it still as an abuse of the role of the affirmative on a resolution for atheism, whose job is to say that there's no true form of theism, not to assume all the forms other than yours are false and then try to just knock down yours.
I don't believe other forms of theism are false. Like
you would in as much as they contradict Mormonism or LDS.
Yeah, but they don't. And like the amount of things that cross over with Catholics, like Catholics believe that there's a God. We both believe in the argument from fine tuning. You know what I mean? Like these are, so it wouldn't, again, he would have to show that Mormonism is the only plausible form of theism. I actually think that there is only one institution that can plausibly make the case that it has that it holds Peter's authority. And Latter-day Saints take as a presupposition that, well, not a presupposition, we agree with the Catholics essentially to say that you don't have the fullness of the church, of the institutional church, if you don't have the institutional church that Jesus established, which had a Petrine sort of office.
Okay. Interesting. So you would, I'm not going to try to reframe it, but thank you for expressing that. Can we talk a little bit about the timeline for that, if that's okay with you?
Another thing that I wanted to discuss was Daniel 2, kind of going back to Daniel 2, if you guys don't mind.
If we could.
I was just about to say, I think Daniel 2 is a good one, because I did. All
right, let's do that then. But I want to talk about the timeline at some point, because I think it matters for whether there's a possible claim here based on your own kind of premises, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, so Daniel 2, the key verse here is 44, and in the days of those kings, the gods of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. And so, Jacob, as I understand it, your response is that the body of believers never goes away, and that's what's really being referred here by the kingdom.
Well, there are a couple ways that this can be understood. I think that is one potential reading of it. But also we have to recognize that this kingdom, when it comes, that won't be destroyed, it comes when there is this mix of iron and clay, and it's and the Pax Romana is when Jesus came. Like Jesus came and establishes his church on Peter during the time, not a divided Roman Empire. He establishes it during the Pax Romana, which was the time when the Roman Empire was the most together like it's ever been. And what's interesting is that Irenaeus, who we've already talked about, Hippolytus, Justin Martyr, and others didn't think of this verse because they gave their thoughts on it, and they saw it as something in the future that was going to come. They didn't believe that, the stone cut out of the mountain has already been, it already happened. They looked at this as a future event. And so I don't think that there's sort of a singular interpretation that existed amongst the early church fathers on this verse saying, oh yeah, the stone was cut out. It already happened. Like, we now are replacing every kingdom on earth. It was seen as a future event connected with the second coming of Jesus amongst the early church fathers, so far as I understand anyway. And I'm not an expert on this, just so you guys know.
That's all right. Well, I mean, this is, I will say, obviously a different position than you took in the debate, which is fine. But I wanted to at least acknowledge that in the debate, you seem to say, yeah, the interpretation given like by the LDS president that it's referring to the coming of Joseph Smith does not seem to square with.
I kind of punted on it, to be honest. The debate, what I wanted to do, and I know it, and again, I'm trying not to be, you guys, I wasn't trying to be dishonest or something. It was that I wanted the debate to focus on the history. I didn't. But
if this is true, like if Scripture is true that Daniel 2 foretells the coming of a kingdom that won't apostatize, which, as far as I know, is the shared interpretation by both traditional Christians and Mormons, and has been affirmed by was it Kimball? Well, at least one of the LDS.
Yeah, no, I would lean towards that. Yes.
Okay. So if it's an anti-apostasy passage,
I'm
then
sort
if that applies
right.
in the first century, then that would win the debate, right? Like, even if I prove nothing else, if I can prove, hey, Scripture foretells prophetically, perfectly, the coming of a kingdom that won't be destroyed in the first century, it won't apostatize. That can't both be true, and the kingdom that comes in the first century does apostatize. Is it fair to say those two things?
You have to define what that kingdom is.
Or the affirmative.
You have to establish what the kingdom is, and you'd have to establish that it came during the Pax Romana.
Well, I'd just say it comes during the Roman Empire, that it comes during the fourth kingdom. Because if you read, actually, if you scroll up slightly there, Cameron.
Yeah. But it says that it comes during the divided kingdom, not the united kingdom, because it says that kingdom eventually shall be divided.
So in verse 40, right, it says there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, and it shall be a divided kingdom, as you see in 41. So I want to be clear there that it's not saying some post-Roman Empire kingdom. Now, you can say whether you think things were too peaceable at the time, but either way, even if we can't pinpoint the exact year from Daniel 2, we can pinpoint the empire that is reigning, and the empire reigning is the Roman Empire. And so,
okay, but it says that it says the timing. Again, if we're talking about the timing of the stone cut out of the mountain, it says it comes later on when it shall be a divided kingdom, and then it says it's so divided that it uses the analogy not just of iron, but of iron and clay.
Right. Because the kingdom will be, it says in 42, like the reason it's doing that is because the kingdom, not kingdoms, plural, the kingdom, the fourth kingdom, shall be partly strong and partly brittle. Now, I would say that seems like a completely accurate description of the Roman Empire in the first century. You have numerous rebellions in Judea alone, which is the focal point of Daniel 2, that you see, various messianic movements that think they can overthrow the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire gets weaker later on, but it would be a mistake to imagine it's completely bulletproof at the time that you have the Zealots, at the time you have, the precursor of the Great Revolt in 70 or the revolt in the early 100s. And my point there being, particularly if the focal point is on Judea, which I think is the best way to read Daniel 2, that the Roman Empire does seem partly strong and partly weak.
You could say that about any time in the Roman Empire, but the Pax Romana was the time when it was the most united. And not only that, you have a time literally when the Roman Empire is split. So
that would be two separate empires functionally, right? Or two separate kingdoms. And this is referring to a time when it's still a kingdom in the singular.
But in verse 44, it says, and in the days of those kings, plural. Yeah. Kings have kingdoms. This is the day of multiple kingdoms. Is the day.
So if I'm talking about like the presidents of the United States, you would say that means there's multiple countries called the United States?
No, I'm saying is that the empire in the actual analogy of Daniel 2, the empire strong as iron, and it's a vertical analogy. It's going from the head downward. It gets to like the waist. everything is together at the waist. It then splits into two. And by the time you get further down in this empire, it's now broken up into all these little pieces that are weak and strong, that have multiple kings. This to me sounds not like the Pax Romana. It sounds like a period that's much later. And not only that, the early church fathers interpreted it as a future event. They didn't say that the stone has already been cut out of the mountain. They saw this as a millennial event that was coming during the second coming.
So how do you get from that to 19th century America?
I don't necessarily do that.
I could understand if you said, like, it doesn't come during this part of Roman history, it comes during this later part of Roman history. But if you apply this as referring to the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then it seems like you have to say, actually, we're in the wrong hemisphere. And it's none of these kingdoms. It's nothing to do with the Roman Empire whatsoever. It's over in America, which is pretty famously not a kingdom.
I wouldn't necessarily say that it doesn't have to do with those. When I would look at this analogy, I would say that the kingdom, the first thing we need to define, are the body of believers, ultimately, who are trying to find Jesus Christ, that because of what he did, but that the fullness expression of the rolling forth of the kingdom is a future millennial event. And I would agree with Irenaeus and the other early church fathers who held that this was describing an event further in the future, because it says that when the stone is cut out of the mountain and collides, what it does is that it replaces all other kingdoms. It ends all other kingdoms. That isn't something that happens until the millennial.
It replaces those four kingdoms specifically. And I think if you look at the history of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis the Roman Empire, even a lot of critics of Catholicism would say the church functionally replaced the Roman Empire. So it actually seems to very neatly prefigure, like, even if there is a sense in which part of it is fulfilled at a future date with the destruction of the Roman Empire, future to Irenaeus, not future to us. We're still in Roman history very squarely there. It doesn't, I don't know how you can get from, I don't know which part of Roman history this is, to actually it's not about these kingdoms at all. Because it's very explicitly about the fourth kingdom, the timing. So it's something apostasy proof.
But it says the kingdom splits, and then it seems to divide even further into smaller groups with kings, plural. So it doesn't seem to be one kingdom. You don't have multiple kings in a single kingdom. Now here's the thing.
If you're looking at the history of the kingdom.
Well, I'm gonna,
like, if I said there are a bunch of Roman, frankly, the Roman Empire even had multiple co-ruling Caesars, depending on which time we're talking about. But leaving that aside, so you could have multiple Caesars within one empire. You could also have multiple Caesars. We're looking at the history of the empire. We can talk about Julius and Augustus, etc., without them being different empires.
So one of the reasons I avoided this in the debate is because we can go back and forth kind of with our different interpretations of exactly what the clay is and what the divided kingdom is and all that kind of stuff. And so to me, this all that I leave it with is, look, this doesn't have one single easy interpretation that everyone agrees on. Even the early church fathers had a different interpretation of it than that this was something that had already happened. So the timing of it and all that, this can all be debated. But my point is that it isn't relevant to the history side of it, which is what I was trying to argue for in the debate. Again, I wasn't trying to be like dishonest. It just was a strategy to say, look, I don't want to get caught in a let's go back and forth over scriptures when the history seems to be sufficient to demonstrate.
Is the history less disputed?
Real quick,
but okay, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, keep your thought, Joe. We've been going for an hour. I'd like to go ahead and get through some super chats that have been sent in. We've got about 23 so far, so let's start hitting some of these. So Become the Night says, how can LDS, the nicest people, live next to the saltiest lake? Seems like a contradiction.
For the record, this is my producer, and he's a goofball.
Oh, nice.
Can I make a comment on that actually real quick?
Yeah.
So do you actually know why? Latter-day Saints could have gone to California. In fact, some encouraged Brigham and them to continue going. But Brigham specifically said, we're going to go where people will leave us alone. And nobody wants this swamp hole next to the Salt Lake. And so that's why we ended up in the Intermountain West.
It's beautiful.
Right,
anyone who hasn't been there, I will give a shout out to it.
Yeah, it is a pretty place. It's very pretty. All right, Blessing 1532. If history proves apostasy, why not disprove LDS?
So
I think he's saying, like, if history disproves, if history proves that there was this apostasy, why doesn't history disprove the claims of the LDS Church?
I think he probably is referring to things like the Book of Mormon, and people will say there's no sort of historical evidence. I would just point people to my debate with Trent Horn to kind of see what those sort of arguments look like, because I tried to give examples from history that I think validate the Book of Mormon.
Any thoughts, Joe?
I read it a different way, but I don't actually know which way is correct. I was thinking he was just saying, if the standard is you've got a heresy arising or you've got a dispute over authority, we see all of that in Mormon history as well, like the RLDS, the Beckerites, and so on. You've got a bunch of schisms. You've got a crisis of succession and all of that. But I'm not sure if that's what this person is asking about or not.
Yeah, and could I actually make a quick comment on that? Because that was another point in the debate. Obviously, everyone got a really good laugh out of my 1965 comment. I want to kind of clarify something. Okay. The idea here is that I actually would agree with you, Joe, that if I were to make the argument that, hey, a change in doctrine or a change in policy or something means you have an entirely new church, that isn't true. What I was trying to get to, though, is I was actually trying to get, maybe I shouldn't have tried to be funny, but I should have gone straight to like, okay, we need to figure out what the essence of the church is. And whatever that essence is, let's say you have to have X in order for the church to exist. And then we have to show that X has had a continual existence. And I was trying to get to the point that for Catholics, an essential characteristic of the Catholic Church is the papacy. And therefore, if you're going to claim that the papacy has a continual existence, then you have to show, and that the Catholic Church, right? Because we're asking, when did the Catholic Church begin? I have to say, okay, at least one of the essential characteristics of the Catholic Church is the papacy. And so when the papacy began, that is when the Catholic Church began. And my point was that was dogmatically defined in Vatican I. Now, I actually would agree with you that before, Vatican I, there was an understanding about the papacy that wasn't dogmatically defined until that point. But I would have a hard time pinpointing exactly when that sort of dogmatic understanding began. I would say it probably, but I would say, and I tried to argue that it didn't exist in the first 300 years of the church. So that was what I was trying to get to with that comment. And I just feel like people maybe didn't understand where I was going with it.
Okay, I didn't know you were joking. I spent like 6 minutes in cross-sex trying to get a straight answer there, but that's.
and I'm sorry, I should have.
Yeah. Well, because I think it matters, because if you're claiming, as like most of your claim, the papacy rose later, then we should expect to see, and this was back to one of the things I was saying before. And so if we can talk about timeline for a second here, if the claim is a great apostasy happened roughly around this year, and you make the argument in your opening statement, Amos 3:7, that these things won't happen without prophecy. Surely the Lord does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets. Then we know, if you're right, we should find great apostasy passages describing this as an ongoing reality when James dies, or when Peter dies, or when John is nearing the end of his life. And of course, we find no such things. And in fact, I think you conceded we find no such things in the New Testament. But similarly, if the rise of the Catholic Church is this event that is either a symptom or a cause of apostasy, one would expect to see some kind of hue and outcry. Like when the Reformation happens, people comment on it. It is a notable event in history. And when any kind of new church or denomination or group arises, particularly one that is radically changing an understanding of the gospel, this is an issue that people have a lot of outcry about. I mean, the history of Mormonism shows this, a history of every major schism, denomination, restoration, etc., points to that. But strangely, for the Catholic Church, we're just kind of vaguely told, well, sometime, not the first 300 years, we don't know when. And this is the most important event in Christian history, it seems, and no one thought to comment on it. I mean,
I would say that a major thing happened in history when the Catholics began to claim their papal universal jurisdiction, that's when the Catholic Church separated from the Orthodox Church. And I would say that what existed originally was something like the Orthodox Church, where you had a collection of bishops, and then all of a sudden Rome looks and goes, hey, we actually are the captain here. And then when that happens, that's what creates the Great Schism. So I would point to the Great Schism as the first great reaction to the papacy sort of asserting its primacy and its identity, really. Because
so you think the 11th century is the first time the papacy asserts any kind of primacy?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that was the first time that it ever did, but I'm saying that's when the reaction to that primacy really happened. That's when the bishops were like, no, this isn't the case. You guys aren't the boss here with ultimate jurisdiction over the entire church. You guys are one of us bishops, maybe a first among equals, but you're not you don't have ultimate immediate Vatican I type jurisdiction over the world.
And okay, I mean, I don't know how much we want to get into that part, but if you're putting that close to the 11th century, or like that's when they start to react to it, it would seem like you'd have to say it was sometime near there. I'm a little vague about what your actual historical claim is, and it seems like your entire affirmative is kind of relying on a particular vision of history that I'm not sure I understand.
So the reality is that if we're going to talk about the identity of the Catholic Church, like when did it begin, we have to define, let's just put as a minimum characteristic, the papacy as defined dogmatically in Vatican I is essential to the Catholic Church. Could we agree on that as essential? Otherwise you don't have the Catholic Church?
Are we talking about like the papacy, or the papacy showing all of its manifestation? And I know that this sounds like a technical thing, but let me give an example. You believe that your prophet can receive new revelation, but if I'm not mistaken, in our lifetime, that has never happened, right? Like the last time is official declaration 2, and then doctrines and covenants.
It depends how you want to define revelation. I believe that he receives ongoing revelation all the time, but what actually gets canonized as something binding?
Okay, then we'll say he has the ability to receive new scripture, but that doesn't actually happen in our lifetime. Like you would recognize a difference between having the capability of exercising a power and actually exercising it, I think. And that it might be even centuries in which a power isn't exercised but still exists.
You're right, but this is I think like I can kind of grant that, but my thing is just this: it's that the primacy in the West, like I would refer to the reason that you can't pinpoint this exact time when the Catholic Church just like popped into being is because of what was stated in the Chieti document, where it says, in the West, the primacy of Rome was understood from the 4th century onwards. The primacy of the Bishop of Rome among the bishops was, and this is the key word, gradually interpreted as a prerogative that was his, and this understanding was not adopted in the East.
Right, but that seems like very obviously not true history. I mean, we've mentioned things in the debate.
That's what
Irenaeus,
the Vatican's handpicked theologian said.
Well, the fact that a group on an ecumenical panel say something silly, I mean, go read other ecumenical documents and you'll quickly discount how much weight you give to ecumenical documents. Unfortunately,
but I would argue, and this is what I tried to argue in the debate, I tried to argue that is what the history shows. It shows
I'm saying I think we could see very clearly from
shows.
Like Irenaeus and Ignatius and people that whether you think their claims are true or not, you can't both believe, 107, Ignatius is talking about the Church of Rome presiding in charity, and that there's no sense of a presiding until the 4th century. Like those two things just can't both be true.
Well,
and so if we accept the authenticity of Ignatius or Irenaeus, but then Ignatius, we're well before.
Even the Vatican is even said about Ignatius in the Ravenna document in 2007. The Vatican said this: Rome as a church that presides in love, according to the phrase of St. Ignatius of Antioch, did not imply a jurisdictional power over the entire church as understood today, but rather a primacy of honor. That's from the Ravenna document, International Catholic Orthodox Dialogue in 2007. My thing is when I look at the Catholic scholars and even things being put out by the Vatican, they admit that these kind of proof texts from church fathers, such as Ignatius, that they don't imply a Vatican I style understanding of the papacy that existed in those centuries. And so it seems to me that it's a gradual.
Yeah, if the argument
development.
is, I mean, the Vatican isn't the one that wrote the Ravenna document, but either way, it's a joint international commission of Orthodox and Catholics.
Okay.
Ascribing that to the Vatican is literally
maybe
not
I'm wrong.
true.
I want to make sure I'm not. Was the Ravenna document? Weren't the people in that appointed by the Vatican to represent the Catholic Church?
There are representatives, but it doesn't have any binding weight of itself. Like when you get a panel, in the same way, like if you got commissioned by the president of your church to say, like, go represent us in this debate, they're not on the hook for everything you might say in the debate. Like
Agreed.
So.
Agreed. And I'm not arguing this. I'm not arguing this from their authority per se. Okay. I'm actually agreeing. I think that what they're stating is the reason they're saying this is because this is what the history shows. They're looking at the same history that I'm presenting and saying, look, this is something that is happening gradually over time. So right now we're talking about this idea of Catholic identity. And if Catholic identity is wrapped up in the Vatican I understanding of the papacy, that has to exist in order for the Catholic Church to exist, then over time, what we see is that it isn't something that instantly existed a long time ago. It's something that gradually emerges over time. And then eventually, at the point of the Great Schism, there is a divide between the Catholic and the Orthodox over this new emergent Catholic identity.
Okay. I mean, I think you've at least, I mean, obviously we're not going to agree on this, but I think we should move on just because I want to respect. I think you've at least clarified that you don't actually think 1965 or 1870 are real answers to the question, which is helpful. I think that actually does move the conversation forward.
I want to backtrack a little bit on it. Just because something isn't dogmatically defined doesn't mean it doesn't exist prior, but I would say that it definitely didn't exist in the earliest days of the church. The papacy is understood in Vatican I.
And if anyone wants more on this, Adrian Fortescue, Eric Ibarra, I think Elijah Yassi, these would all be good places to look in terms of just getting more into the history of what the early Christians said on this. I think it actually, I've met a lot of Catholic converts who were very surprised at the evidence there, but it's much too much to get into all of that right now and fairly far afield, I think, from the theme of a great apostasy.
All right. Next super chat, Gage Waltz. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I love when people continue to say Merry Christmas after December 25th.
After the 25th. Yeah. Dinkeldork says, we see two patterns in history, Japan and the Maronite Catholic Church. Both had isolated Christians. Both knew when authority had been kept or lost locally. Where is that same historical admission for the GA?
Great apostasy. I don't know how much you know about the history of those, and I would even add in Korea you have some of this as well. But like in Japan, they outlawed Catholicism and really brutally persecuted it. If you've seen Silence or any of those things,
I saw that new movie about
that. Despite that, there was a faithful community of Christians, and so you have a not very institutionally connected body of believers, if you want to call it a body of believers. I think body of believers should be more, whatever. But either way, you've got individual faithful who are meeting individually and in groups and preserving the faith, but are keenly aware of the fact that they don't have institutional continuity and authority. So I think Dinkeldork is wondering, well, if the early Christians are in that situation, do they realize it? Like, do we find them talking about that?
So I would say that one of the key claims here is I'm not talking about any, like, it isn't like there were no authorities left in the church whatsoever. Like, I do believe that there were bishops who were appointed by apostles that existed in the church. What I'm saying, though, is there's a difference between a local authority who's been given a local jurisdiction and an ultimate central authority that acts as the adjudicator amongst those authorities. Because if you only have local authorities that are not ultimately being guided by revelation, that don't have an infallible teaching office, as the Catholics would say, well, then you're going to get exactly what Catholicism has says you'll get, which is schism and division and doctrinal drift over time.
But okay, so maybe I could just ask the question again. Do the early Christians realize they're missing something that is essential?
Yeah, to a certain. I think that they were doing the best with what they had, and they understood that the apostles, they wanted to preserve what the apostles had given. Right? They recognized that they couldn't receive new revelation. They recognized that they were still fallible humans. They didn't believe in an infallible teaching office in the early church. And so what did they try and hold on to? They tried to hold on to any of the apostolic writings that they could find and preserve them. And they thought in their mind, hey, if we hold on to these things and we preserve them and we do everything we can to try and hold on to what we have in the scriptures and according to the traditions that we know, well, then we'll be good. But if there's no one there who's ultimately the infallible, that holds that infallible office to bind them all together and to make sure that error doesn't arise, eventually they're going to start to mess things up over time, which is, again, it's what we see in the history.
I want to press that history, if I may, both because I don't know if you've actually answered the question yet of whether they were aware of having lost something. Like, obviously they're aware the apostles aren't still alive, but if you read like First Clement, it doesn't sound like they view this as something was meant to be passed on, but wasn't. He describes this succession from the apostles to the bishops as being like from the Father sending the Son sending the apostles sending the bishops. And we wouldn't say, oh no, something has been lost because, now it's the apostles and not Jesus walking among us. Now, if someone thought Jesus was going to physically, visibly be governing the church, then yeah, they might regard that as an apostasy. But if they understood, like, no, that was not intended to last after, 40 days after the resurrection, then it would be a change, but not an apostasy. So if you're arguing that there is a change, sure. But if you're arguing that there's an apostasy, do they know that there's an apostasy?
I think what they viewed as is they said, we are the body of believers, and like a Protestant would. Is a Protestant know that they're in apostasy? You believe that the Protestants are ultimately believe in a great apostasy, but none of the Protestants think so. They all
plenty
think
of Protestants say they believe in an apostasy. I mean, Roger Williams is like, prior to Joseph Smith. There's a bunch of Protestants who believed in an apostasy.
But they believe that the Catholic Church is apostate. They don't believe that they are in a state of apostasy. And the early believers were just like that. They said, look, we have the writings of the apostles. We will preserve them. We will hold this whole thing together. And that's what we're going to do. And frankly, here's my thing. I don't crap on the early Christians. They were doing the best they could. They were good and honorable people. But the problem is that they had to deal with questions that ultimately could only be resolved, such as the nature of Christ, that could only be resolved through some sort of a revelatory means, because there wasn't clear understanding about, for example, the nature of Jesus and his relationship to the Father. And so they had to try their best to figure that out without divine revelation to guide them in that process. And that's why in the early church, in the first century, they're all subordinationists, essentially. Subordinationism is the New Testament doctrine. It's the position of the early church fathers. And then eventually that begins to change out into the Trinitarian formula.
I've got some good stuff on that I actually had prepared for the debate, thinking you might go there. And now you bring that up. Now I feel like we don't have... I'll just say there's plenty of reasons to doubt that version of history. One of them being that the Trinitarians that we see in like the second century, or, the word Trinity is first used in 181, but you have this same thing being expressed, that there are ways of reading earlier stuff referring to a legitimate distinction between the first and second person of the Trinity, that the first sends the second. In our Thursday night talk, or like the discussion thing we did with Aaron, I mentioned this as kind of the soft Trinitarian monarchalism, that you can, in other words, this is much more in the weeds, but I think it's way too simplistic to just assert that they were subordinationists, because subordinationism was condemned while the people that are now accused of being subordinationists were canonized as saints by the same people. But if I may, dang it, I completely forgot where I was going to go. Okay, I'm sorry. It'll come to me later. I'm just going to, sorry.
That's all right. We have more super chats, right?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Cameron, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, what a theme.
Yep. What I was going to say is that we need to run through these.
Sorry, I remembered the question. I'm so sorry.
Quicker.
But it's just because it's about something you just said. I don't want to completely lose that thread. because you talked about how the early Christians were these good and honorable people who were seeking to follow after Christ. And I'm trying to harmonize that with the fact that they were so wickedly corrupt that the priesthood and keys were removed from the earth. And I don't know how those two stories can both be true.
There's a mix of both. In the New Testament itself, it talks about people creeping in among you. It like the scriptures are very clear that there is a problem with, and you would even admit, you would just call it sort of personal apostasy that existed within the church. So it is a combination of both within the church that exists.
So I'd be fine affirming that, but I wouldn't believe that is a universal apostasy, which is the term that your church uses.
You're right. And by universal, what it's referring to is the universal loss of the ultimate authority on earth. That ultimate authority no longer existed. And that ultimate authority is, when that is lost, you no longer have the fullness of the church. You can't claim to.
So I understood. And they don't notice this when it happens, apparently.
No, well, Paul says this. Paul warns the Ephesian elders. He says, for I know this, that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among yourselves, okay, so he's talking about within the church, men will rise up, speaking twisted things to draw away disciples after themselves. So it's very clear that the picture in the early church was that there were problems even within the governance of the church of apostates that existed within the institution, that he was saying, look, when I'm gone, like, they're not going to spare the flock here, guys. So it's not like it was all sunshine and rainbows.
Oh, no one's claiming sunshine and rainbows. Like, we both acknowledge that there are heretics that arise, again, both in early Christianity and in modern Mormonism and in modern Catholicism, that you will find people who come in speaking perverse things, trying to draw the disciples after them, right? But that doesn't automatically get you, like, to get from there to a great apostasy is quite a jump, given that that's not where the passage ends. Paul goes on and says, therefore be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears. And now I commend you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all those who are sanctified. That doesn't sound like he's saying, I'm about to leave this group of people and it's going to fall into an apostasy. It's saying, be alert, and you're actually going to be able to survive this.
No, and I do to a certain extent agree, but you also have to remember that Paul also says to the Thessalonians, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of sin revealed. And so there's
I thought we were going to talk about that in the debate, but
well,
because when is that referring to?
That's referring to a time before the second coming of Jesus Christ. So he says,
and he calls it the latter days.
Yeah, it's in the future. He's saying in the future, after his life, a day will come, or he says, for that day will not come, meaning the second coming of Jesus will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of sin is revealed. So he's predicting that there's going to be some sort of a future event, an apostasy within the church. Now, I'm not going to say that this proves it, okay? But what this text does is it points to some future event that is, he literally uses the word apostasia.
But yes, but he's specifically talking about the end times. And neither your church nor mine believes that's going to be a universal apostasy in the last days, right?
Well, he's talking about...
Because if he's saying the latter days are the first century...
Let's go to what the verse actually says. He says, all he says in the verse is for that day. I'm just going to replace that with the second coming. He says, the second coming will not come unless the apostasy comes first. So he's saying, you have the apostasy, or I'm sorry, the second coming is over here. He's right here. Sometime in between that space, an apostasy will happen. So,
and
what's
so you're
the
saying
verse?
that could be like a few years later?
2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, it might be good to get the whole context there, because it's about the coming of Jesus. It's 2 Thessalonians 2, really beginning with the first, might be good.
Right. And it is, my contention is just that it shows that there is, he points out that before the second coming of Jesus, there will be an apostasy. Now, what does he mean? Does he mean that it'll just be a a small scale apostasy of some people? What will this look like? Will it be the loss of the entire body of believers? I don't believe it means the loss of the entire body of believers. The bride of Christ is dead. But I think that when I look at history, based on history, I can say, I think that this verse is pointing to the loss of central authority and the ultimate sort of schism and doctrinal drift that we see throughout Christian history.
So I would say it seems to me from the context that this is about the man of lawlessness. And it's about the rise of this Antichrist figure in the last days and the final tribulation. And I think that if you read this alongside all of the other passages where St. Paul predicts that event, this is something at the very close of history, not at the very dawn of Christian history. Whereas the great apostasy, I mean, if you're right that the great apostasy is when Peter dies or John dies, it's a little unclear still which one.
I think we got to be a little bit. I'd be careful to ever say that the great apostasy is the death of the final apostle. The apostasy is what happens as a natural result of their loss.
But you think the reason that they're not replaced is because they've left the gospel principles, right?
I think because
this is what I was asking before. If the early Christians are these faithful followers of Jesus, even if not all of them are, of course, not all of them are ever going to be. But if there is this body of faithful people following after Jesus, why would God take their authority away from them? The only thing keeping back doctrinal error.
Honestly, I would say a couple things. First and foremost is I think that it wasn't just the faithful Christians that were against them. I think the institutions of the day would have just, like, it couldn't exist. They would kill a centralized leader of a centralized group that was growing at the rate that the Christians were growing. Number two, I would also say that you can say, well, why did Jesus wait, or why did God wait 2,000 years or thousands of years to send the Messiah? Why does God, when you ask, like, why doesn't God do this? It's sort of one of those questions that an atheist would ask a Christian and can ask about anything. Why doesn't God just snap his fingers and save everyone?
Well, no, it's like, why, if the apostasy is a punishment for leaving gospel principles, I can understand that story. I'm not sure if that's the story you're telling. That's the story I've gotten from Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint documents.
No, I would say that it was, so I start with the history. I look back at the history. I can see that there's this loss of central authority and schism. And then I say, okay, well, what are the reasons for that? That's a much harder sort of question to ask. But I do think that there are good reasons to believe that institutions that existed in the early church, first of all, those institutions killed the apostles. Okay. They killed the ones that were there, and they would have killed new ones if they had been called. And not only that, eventually the Roman Catholic Church, even if God would have wanted to call a prophet, they would have said, you're a heretic, and they would have killed him as well. So I can see, as I look over the entirety of Christian history, I can see wickedness that exists to such an extent where God couldn't have called a new apostle or prophet, even if he wanted to.
Why couldn't he? I don't understand that part. Like you mentioned in the debate, Matthew 23:37, where Jesus says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to you." That didn't keep him from sending prophets to Israel. Like the fact that people are going to be martyrs for the faith.
Who is the prophet after Malachi?
There were a bunch of prophets after Malachi.
Okay, where are their writings?
We've got them in the Deuterocanon.
So just after Malachi, who's the next one? Was there a break anywhere in there?
No, it's an ongoing thing. And Jesus says, "The law and the prophets testify till John."
So
this whole idea of a 400-year.
Who was the prophet?
I don't remember the order. But in terms of, like, even at the birth of Jesus, you still have Anna the prophetess in Luke 2.
So why is that? Well, my question is, why is there this intertestamental period?
There isn't.
Why doesn't the Bible continue right on down from Malachi to John the Baptist?
That's a Protestant assumption. We don't accept that. Like, you've got no major gap in time.
So you're saying
Judas Maccabeus. Like, so for instance, in John 10, when Jesus is celebrating Hanukkah in the temple, where is that coming from?
When Jesus is, what was that?
The Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah. In John 10, Jesus goes down to Jerusalem for the Feast of Hanukkah.
I'm not even disputing the Deuterocanon here. What I'm saying is the Deuterocanon doesn't fill in the entire gap between Malachi and John the Baptist.
I mean, is the argument just that you could find some time where there's not someone living giving new scripture? There's no period of prophetic silence.
I would say that between Malachi and Jesus, there's a ton of gaps. It's at best, even if we grant the Catholic assumptions of the Deuterocanon, that there are massive gaps in there where there are no prophets. And then, like, what is Jesus talking about when he's saying that he is leaving their house unto them desolate because they killed the prophets that he was sending to them?
What is the house of Israel? It's the temple. What happens 40 years after Jesus says those words? I mean, the destruction of the temple. So Jesus, when he talks about the house, this is a reference to the temple. Like in John 2, when he talks about how his Father's house is to be a house of prayer for all people, but you made it a den of thieves, that's about the temple. A lot of what he's doing here.
I can see what he's saying there, but he's pointing out that he has tried in the past to send prophets to them and they kill them. That's why he says, I'm leaving your house unto you desolate. Like that's
right. And so the temple is destroyed. Well, he continues to have the church, which is the new house, which is why it's described as a household of God in 1 Timothy 3:15. That what he has done is he's allowed the old house to be destroyed and to be made desolate because of the infidelity of the people, but he hasn't left them apostate. He has come and built a new house. The house is his body. John 2, he spoke of the temple of his body. And then it's the body of Christ, both in the sense of Jesus's physical body, the body of Christ in the Eucharist, the body of Christ, the church. So that's what we would say the temple of God is. And you can find all throughout the New Testament references to the house of God and the temple of God using that language for all three of those.
Latter-day Saints don't dispute that ultimately Christ was building a new house with the foundation of his church. We would say that church was founded upon the rock of revelation in Peter being the revelatory source, and that central authority was lost, but the body of believers did the best they could, and God built the kingdom on earth the best that he could. Now, if
but that's what I'm saying. Like, he doesn't leave the house desolate in the New Testament. He leaves the house in Jerusalem desolate, but only because he builds a new and better house.
I know, but
and so that's not an apostasy. Like that's
but it isn't the house part isn't the focus of the verse. The verse, the whole reason I brought up this verse is to point that Jesus is pointing to times in the past when he had sent prophets to them, and then the people had killed those prophets. Okay. And then you have periods in the past that he's referring to where there are no prophets that are being accepted. He's pointing out that because the Jewish people
are you saying there's no prophets, or just that the prophets aren't being listened to? Because those seem like two very different claims.
Well, no, the prophets weren't being listened to and they were being killed. Those are both the claims that Jesus makes in that verse. So when Jesus is looking in the past and he's saying, look, he's saying to Jerusalem, like, you guys were supposed to be the chosen people that were supposed to carry this work on. I was supposed to be able to establish my kingdom before you. I sent you all these prophets and you kill them and stone them. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to alter the way this is going to work, and I'm going to leave your house unto you desolate. So what he's saying is, he's pointing out that God won't work with people when they just reject him ultimately. And he'll only work with the people to the greatest degree that they can. That's the whole, like, you have to remember, why didn't he come in the time of Moses? Your answer to that would be
that he was waiting for the fullness of time.
Why was he waiting for the fullness of time?
The answer, because he is building towards the coming of the Messiah. In many and various ways, he's revealed himself by our fathers, by the prophets, to our fathers by the prophets. Correct. But now he's revealed himself by the Son.
Why did he have to wait?
Because he's bringing them out of error and into the truth. Like,
okay, so in other words, God
this
has
is
to
why
work.
St. Paul talks about the law as pedagogos, like a teaching slave. It's about you, like, in the same way, like, why don't you just give like a final seminary exam to a 3-year-old? Well, because you have to form them in the faith. They need milk before meat. This is the patience and mercy of God.
I did, while you guys were talking, I did look it up. There are bigger gaps in the Old Testament between like Malachi and Daniel than there are between the Deuterocanon and the New Testament.
And I would agree. I'm not saying that it only existed in that time. The point that I'm driving at here is simply this. Okay. The idea is that there is precedent for Jesus saying that he will withhold his prophets and will do something different when people do not cooperate. And the whole point of the Old Testament story that Joe is pointing out is that God has to work with fallible human beings. It isn't God who fails. It's us who fail him. And he will work with us to the degree that we can in the environment that existed within the ancient world, okay, to establish a central authority the way that he did, resulted in them all being killed. And ultimately, God worked with humans the best that he could to preserve his gospel until there was a time in which the fullness of the institution could be restored. That is the
I think I understand the story you're telling. I don't see where any of the verses you pointed to say that. The closest I can think of isn't one you mentioned, but would be the parable of the wicked tenants in Matthew 21, where because they kill all of the servants that he sends, he then says, what therefore will the owner of the vineyard, when therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, he will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruit of in their seasons. And then Jesus affirms that and then says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruits of it. Now that seems very clearly to be talking about this Jewish Gentile thing and the rise of the church and the replacement, if you want to use the word replacement, I know that's a controversial word, something is being given. But even there, he doesn't just say, therefore nobody's going to get anything. I'm just going to turn the car around.
So unfortunately, we need to move on.
Okay.
I've allotted about 2 hours for this stream, and we're coming up on the 1 hour, 45 minute mark. And we have about 40 super chats to get through. So what we're going to have to do is kind of go a little bit quicker through the remaining super chats. The problem is that our audience is very intelligent. Okay, like if you tune into like another stream and you see their super chats, it's like jokes or like trolling or whatever else, and so they're able to just like read it and move on. We have actual intelligent people that follow our show, and so that's what kind of makes it difficult, is that these questions end up opening up new avenues of exploration. And so that's what drags this thing out, which is like a good and a bad problem. Like this is great, but at the same time, it's like it takes a lot to unpack.
We'll try and
like
be quick.
For example, like this next one, when did the great apostasy happen and what caused it? Also, how do you rationalize 1 Nephi 13, 1-9? Is it referencing Catholicism or Islam? Like this is not going to be an easy, 60-second response unless Jacob, you can just super impress me.
To answer this one, let me actually pull it something real quick. Let me just get 13.
Yeah, so I actually have it on the screen if you want me.
Oh, here, let me do real quick. Let me do the first part of the question. Okay, when did the great apostasy happen? That question presupposes that it was like this event. I don't believe that it's an event. It's a description of the entire history of it, which was predicated on an event that happened, which was the loss of that central and ultimate adjudicating authority, as I talked about earlier. And then what happens over time is the apostasy. The apostasy is sort of the ongoing effects of that loss of central authority. And we take that whole thing and we put it in a box and we call it the great apostasy. So that's how we would kind of address that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
You want to talk about the great and abominable church in 1 Nephi 13? Because like this was historically, Mormons understood this to be a reference as the Catholic Church being bad. But as relations between Mormons and Catholics improved,
you mean Bruce R. McConkie?
Actually, even if you read the Wikipedia page on it, Neil Young, not that Neil Young, talks about how McConkie was originally uncontroversial on this point. But later, as there's like a warming of relations between Catholics and Mormons, and in general, like Protestants and Catholics as well, like it's just way less likely to hear people refer to Catholics as like the whore of Babylon these days. They moved away from this, but
let me real quickly just explain the Book of Mormon. How many churches does it say exists in the Book of Mormon?
Well, in one sense, two, and
it says two churches.
We talked about that, yeah.
I just want to be clear on what we actually teach and believe. What we teach and believe is that according to the Book of Mormon, there are saved but two churches. Okay. There's the Church of the Lamb and the Church of the Devil, which is sometimes called the whore of all the earth and Babylon and all that kind of stuff. So that notion, okay, it's a it's the same as Jesus talking about the sheep and the goats, right? It's an analogy to good and evil, and that there are good and evil institutions in the world. And there are, within institutions, there is good and evil. So whether you are fighting for the cause of Christ and helping to build up the church of the Lamb, or are you helping to build up the church of the devil that moves people away from Jesus Christ? So in a sense, could we say that the Catholic Church has done certain demonic and terrible things? I think all of us could agree that those sorts of things have happened. And I would call that, when it does that, it's acting as part of the church of the devil. But when it does good and wonderful and holy things that bring people closer to Jesus, then it's working as part of the church of the Lamb. So you can't just label the Catholic Church as the church of the devil, and you have to make that sort of an important distinction.
All right, let's move on to our next one. Jazzy Jack's jokes hack. LDS doctrines are contradicted by first century Christianity, celestial marriage, polygamy, temple worship, but they believed Eucharist wine equals blood. I'm not really sure what this one's getting at, and maybe you guys can help me interpret.
I might, but yeah, I'll let you take a step. Okay, well, here's what I think the argument is, that if your version of history is right, you have a loss of institutional authority and error creeps in, and we'd expect to find a fight between like the good guys and the bad guys, and maybe the bad guys win out. Like that, I think, is more or less the version of the story that you're telling, right? Like the doctrinal drift isn't that everybody immediately just becomes a heretic or an apostate. It's that people are trying to follow Jesus. They've heard the apostles. They've literally like listened to the apostles, but now you've got people misrepresenting the apostles, and it's harder to defend without the apostles being around. Is that a fair representation of your?
Yeah, I would say it's something like what you think would happen if we didn't have a pope. That ultimately what will happen is that you'll get schism, doctrinal drift, and even if people are doing their best, that over time you're going to have things break up and get corrupted.
Exactly. But that over time is doing a lot of work there, because you would still have a lot of people who remembered, well, no, I remember when the Pope taught this, or I remember, the church taught that. And so even if you had that situation, you would find people who were stalwartly defending the traditional faith. But when you go back and look at the early controversies,
just like we have the writings of heretics.
Right, exactly. And so you absolutely do have people who try to present false teachings, but they're being knocked down. But on something like the fight against Gnosticism, this is why I mentioned the way you were using Hegesippus as opposed to what Hegesippus said. There was a Catholic side and a Gnostic side. Now, Hegesippus was clearly pro the Catholic side. He traced every pope when he was in Rome in the mid-100s. He was very much a believer in the Catholic side of that debate. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you'd have to say there's no one who looks visibly Mormon in their belief. And you might be able to pick a thing here or there that you say sounds like you. Like you tried to do a subordinationism earlier.
We could do a whole debate on that.
Well, I mean, let me just put it to you as a question. Is there anyone in the early church at all after the time of the apostles where you could point to them and say that is a proto-Mormon?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like who?
We have, for example, I mean, you have people like Origen, who's talking, I believe, I have to look some of these up. We have early church fathers teaching creation ex materia. We have early church fathers who are talking.
Well, I'm not saying could you find somebody who might agree with you?
I have. I mean, I can go through a list here. Like, if you want me to lay it out.
So okay. So who would be someone who you would just say, that guy's on our team?
Irenaeus, for example, he doesn't hold to a Catholic view of transubstantiation. He talks about the Eucharist consisting of two realities, earthly and heavenly.
Too. Right.
I know, but what I'm saying, well, no, in the Eucharist, my understanding is that there's only one reality, and that is
But there's also the visible earthly elements, like the appearances. We would say substance and accidents to describe those two realities now. But he also talks about the Eucharist as sacrifice and talks about the Eucharist as actually becoming the body and blood of Christ. But wait, let's take Irenaeus for a second.
Quick. No. But there aren't. See, but within the Eucharist.
Are you just saying he agrees with you on the Eucharist?
It is substantially, ultimately, all Jesus's body. Okay, the appearance of it may be as bread, but its substance, what it actually is not two things. It's only one thing in reality.
So you're using reality differently than saying two realities, like a substance.
What I'm saying is that You're right.
But either way, I'm asking you a question about, are there any early Mormons? If you're claiming
early
Irenaeus
Mormon
is an
doctrines,
early Mormon
doctrines,
you're going to have a hard time squaring that with his views on apostolic succession.
I don't think I'm going to have a hard time
or
finding
closing
a
of
ton
Revelation.
First of all, the early church fathers were and the New Testament are subordinationist. They are
Irenaeus?
also I'd have to look on Irenaeus in particular, but I could do this because I've looked in the past. I don't have all of them pulled up right in front of me, obviously. Okay. We have creation ex materia being taught. We have secret rituals.
By Irenaeus?
I'm not claiming Irenaeus. I'm just talking about church fathers in general. I don't have all the references right here. I can pull them up. If I had time, I could get them all.
Do this thing where they take a pastiche of like a line from this person and a line from that person, and they kind of stitch them together. Irenaeus warns about this.
We have Joe. How else am I supposed to show? Joe, how else am I supposed to show these early Christians talking about LDS specific doctrines if I can't?
Yeah, I'm telling you. Like,
well, his question was about like one person who held to like maybe more than one LDS doctrine.
Like, because I may be mistaken, but I think you would regard.
Let me go through.
Okay.
They all believed in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. They all held to the virgin birth. Go through the early, like the Nicene Creed. We agree with 95% of it. We don't believe, like, the core of our beliefs aren't these sort of things that are on the side, or these. The core of our beliefs are very, very similar to Catholic beliefs. Okay, the distinctive LDS beliefs can be supported within the early church fathers, even better than a lot of Catholic doctrines. Things like there's way better patristic support for creation ex materia than there is for something like the bodily assumption of Mary. And so my point is, if we want to get into our unique doctrines, I would argue that the unique LDS doctrines are way better supported than things like papal primacy, transubstantiation as understood in its fullness, and things like the Marian dogmas. So
I debate the Eucharist one in my book, The Early Church was the Catholic Church, and then I covered again in the Eucharist is really Jesus.
I agree.
I don't think you're going to win that.
If you wanted to have this debate, which unique doctrines have better patristic support?
And I specifically wanted to know, are these people you regard as proto-Mormons?
And compare them to like ex materia or secret rituals for initiates that aren't for public consumption, which is something that Latter-day Saints hold to. Like, if your church doesn't have secret rituals that aren't for general public consumption, then you're missing something that actually existed in the early church according to the church fathers. Things like what our Latter-day Saint temple rituals are.
So it seems like you're kind of
I think we need to move on. I don't think we're going to get... Okay, so Colby Reddish says, it's as simple as this. If Jacob wanted a debate on the papacy that lined up with his opening statement, why didn't he offer that as the topic? Makes it look, even if unintentionally, like bad faith.
So as I already explained, the papacy is central to what the Great Apostasy is. We have two groups that are claiming this ultimate central adjudicating authority. And I don't think that any other candidate even claims to have that sort of ultimate central adjudicating authority. And because the LDS claim is predicated on the existence of that central authority and then the effects of its loss, the only one that can really have that sort of a debate is going to be a Catholic. And it is the primary, it's kind of like I had in that image. It's either our president of our church is holding onto those keys or the Catholics are. And we both think that these keys are necessary to avoid schism and doctrinal drift.
But we don't mean
it wasn't dishonest. It's just, that's what the nature of the apostasy is. The apostasy debate is a debate about the central authority.
I mean, isn't saying it's got to be one of the two of us question begging? I mean, no. I would agree it's got to be one of the two of us, but I would say if Catholicism is false, there are a long list of candidates that I think would be still more logically likely.
But not from the they would, but that again, that doesn't understand what the Latter-day Saint of the claim of the Great Apostasy is. The Latter-day Saint claim is that when you lose that central authority, you will inevitably get an apostasy. Okay. And so when you say, well, but maybe you wouldn't, That's just to say, well, then you don't understand what we're trying to convey when we talk about the Great Apostasy as an event that happened in history, or as a series of events that happened in history. Would probably put it better.
All right, let's move on. So Jazzy Jax again says, Jacob proved, and this is sort of relevant to what we're talking about, so maybe we can expand on some things. Jacob proved orthodoxy, not the Great Apostasy. The OG 1835 DNC says God has no body. First vision didn't happen. Race ban equals the prophets led astray for 100 years.
They got their $5 worth out of that one.
Yeah, they did indeed.
A lot of assertions in there. I proved orthodoxy. I think I quite literally agreed with Joe about all the problems with orthodoxy and why it doesn't have the fullness of the institutional church, which is what the Catholics believe about the Orthodox. And they believe the papacy is necessary for that reason. So anyway, that's the part, at least, that's relevant to the discussion.
All right. Gazalem says, Jacob's resolution, good reasons to believe LDS claims about great apostasy. He's affirmative with initial burden. Disproving Catholic papacy does not equal proof universal authority lost. 100 AD everywhere plus LDS apostasy claims are true.
Can I just ask something directly?
Yeah.
Your opening line, you said, Joe is here to claim that the Pope has always sat in the chair of Peter, and therefore all believers in Christ, including Protestants and Orthodox, must submit to the infallible dictates of the Pope. Do you think that's true?
Do I think
that was my burden as the negative?
I would say it this way. Yes, if you were going to try and refute the claims of the Great Apostasy as I understood them. So if you're going to refute the existence of this central and ultimate authority, and you want to refute by saying, hey, this is not the Latter-day Saint claim. Okay, so the Latter-day Saint claim is that there was a loss in the central authority. That's my burden of proof, to show that it doesn't have a continual existence. So, and
I think you also said earlier in this, you wanted to say that and the doctrinal drift, or you think just the institutional authority loss would be enough?
Well, I would say that Catholics and Latter-day Saints both agree that without that central authority, that's what will result. And that is what resulted in history. And so what I was saying is my burden of proof was this. I had to prove that there is no continual institution that has existed that has the central authority, and that because of that authority has prevented doctrinal drift over time. Okay? The opposite to that, to disprove that notion, to disprove it, you have to show that there is an institution. Now, I'm assuming as a Catholic that you would come into the debate and say the reason the Great Apostasy is false is because the Catholic Church is true, and it disproves it.
I mean, that would be one argument I could take. Just like you could argue against atheists by saying Christianity is true, therefore atheism is false. You could also just prove classical theism is true, and therefore atheism is false.
Well, the thing is I was not assuming that you were going to point to another church outside of the Catholic Church that would be true, because I believe that the Catholic arguments against those churches are valid. And so I believe, and I do believe this, I believe the only institution in town that can claim to hold the central authority originally established by Jesus Christ, essential to the fullness of the church, is the Catholic Church. They're the only ones who can make a legitimate claim or attempt to make a legitimate claim throughout history of that institution founded by Christ existing throughout time.
I mean,
here's an analogy. Let me give an analogy. I know that Joe really likes examples and stuff. So suppose that I made the claim that no one in my house has the keys to the house. Okay, and that's what I was trying to defend. And then my view, someone else was making that claim, and then my view is that I have the keys, that I'm the one that has them like on my keychain or whatever. And then someone, is making the claim that no one in the house has the keys. But suppose I had like additional reasons to think that if it wasn't me, then it was someone else. Okay, if it wasn't me that had the keys, it was my wife that had the keys. Maybe it was my oldest child that had the keys or something along those lines. If you could give me good arguments to think that the key is not on my keychain, I would still, from there, go to like my wife having the keys, as opposed to there being no set of keys at all, right? So I think that's maybe the idea, is that even if you could show that the Catholic Church, the papacy, is false, we wouldn't immediately assume great apostasy. We would immediately assume, oh, well, then it must be somewhere else. So that, and you've given arguments, here for that conclusion, but you didn't give them in the debate. And so that's...
Well, and I totally agree with you in this sense. If there are multiple people that were in the house with you who had access to those keys, okay, then me just showing that, like, your wife doesn't have them, well, it could be your kids, it could be anyone else, you know what I mean, that had the keys, because the keys are missing. But what if all of your family is demonstrably on vacation, have been for the last 3 months, you've been home alone, you had the keys yesterday, and now they're missing? It's like, I can't say that someone else has them. My point is,
right. Well, Joe's argument is, because he appealed to scripture, right? He was like, well, Daniel 2 shows that the kingdom is going to have, the new kingdom is never going to go away. It's going to be there forever. So you'd have analogously, you'd have some reason to think that if I didn't have the keys, someone's got to have the keys, because this doesn't go away, right? Someone has to have the keys.
Depends on how you define, but that gets into how are you defining the kingdom? Again, if you presuppose that the kingdom is the papacy or is some other institution that holds that central authority, number one, if the scriptures say something that just blatantly contradict history, well, then either the scriptures are wrong or your interpretation of those scriptures are wrong. And what that's why I went to the history specifically, to try and demonstrate that the only institution that even makes the claim to go all the way back are the Catholics. And therefore, the only institution that I would need to disprove in order to show that the original Petrine office ceased to exist and therefore schism resulted is the Catholic institution. And here's the thing. I know people may disagree with this. I guarantee you people do. And people have different opinions. I just hope people can see I wasn't being dishonest. It was just the way that I was trying to approach the argument based on my understanding of what my church teaches about the great apostasy.
Yeah, I think what you'd have to have done in the debate is, like, analogously argue that the whole family was on vacation, instead of just assume that because your debate opponent had the belief that his church has the keys.
Well, and ultimately I would say that the Catholics and Latter-day Saints both agree that no one else holds those keys. Like, no one.
Well, no, we regard the Orthodox as authentic churches, so it is a different, this is mixing together a lot of different things. We would say the fullness, absolutely, but if I think the way you're kind of posing this hypothetical is, what if Jesus meant for there to be a papacy, but then there wasn't a papacy? And I think if you're going to take that presupposition, we would say, well, there should be a papacy, not there should be Mormonism or something like that. So even if we grant the kind of presuppositions it sounds like you're working from, it seems like I think it would be a much cleaner debate if we just said, let's argue for this instead of assuming it, and then work from there. Like, here's how we can know we need to have one central authority, and this is, and so on.
All right. Unfortunately, we got to move on to some more super chats. There's so many to get through, and we're like over time already. So some of these I'm just going to put up on the screen, and people can read them, and then we're not going to be able to get to all of these. What I'm going to do is focus on the $20 and above. We'll get through those, and then if we have time, we'll come back. So Cactoid Jim says Rigdon and Young fought for. Is that how you say that? Rigdon and Young fought for the presidency. Strange and Smith III and 60 plus others founded their own LDS denominations. How does this not apply to LDS as well? Seems like you cut off the branch you're sitting on.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's fairly simple. There still was an ultimate centralized authority in the apostleship, just as had existed. Brigham Young was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which is the next highest office when the first presidency is ultimately dissolved. And so it's if you go with the biblical precedent, ultimately there that the apostolic office is the ultimate sort of authority in the church, and that there is a president of that quorum, a chief apostle, as it were. That was the seat that was held by Brigham Young at that time. So again, it's all about, this is why the central authority thing matters, because if you don't have a central authority and you just have equal authorities vying for power, then you get legitimate claims from equal authorities trying to decide who it is that is the ultimate authority now. But if you have an ultimate authority, then you don't get schism, or then you don't get schism. You may get apostasy, people who break away from that ultimate authority, but the ultimate authority is still holding the institution together, which is what the Catholics claim.
All right. Yeah, Joe, I know you want to come back on that. We're unfortunately just going to have to power through here.
Yeah, I'm trying to respect. I'm also seeing really good questions fly on screen too. But
yeah. Unfortunately, we have like so many. We're only about a fourth of the way through. So, and I want to do as much as I can to respect everyone's questions. So we'll at least put them up on the screen if I can't have each of you guys respond to them with the time that we have left. So the Messenger Reveals says Lucifer is a Latin word from the Latin Vulgate that mistakenly found its way into the King James Version translation. Joseph Smith added it to his Doctrine and Covenants vision, not realizing it was a mistranslation in the KJV. Mic drop. You don't really have to respond to that one if you don't want to. It's super off topic.
I'm not. Yeah, the ones that are just coming in off topic. Let's just keep going.
All right. Ward Radio, substantial super chat. Thanks, Carden. He says, my understanding of the great apostasy is simple. After Jesus ascended, outside doctrinal influences began to influence the church negatively. The apostles held back this influence, and Peter led the church while they were alive, but more coming. Let's see.
There's more coming, Carden. You proved it. No. Oh, wait.
But ultimately, the apostles were martyred and that authority was lost. Why else would we need so many ecumenical councils to establish orthodoxy? It was because the authority of apostles and prophets was missing and more. Let's see if I can find his last one.
He's giving huge chunks of money every time. This is amazing.
Yeah, and men cannot vote in councils to preserve truth as well as apostles can testify of it authoritatively in person. This is why the Catholic position and Mormon position is so strong. He says more. Let's see. Either Mormons are right, restoration, or Catholics are right, preservation. But since both quote scripture, the argument will be settled not by scripture but through history. I was hoping for a robust historical defense.
I would just challenge that premise and say we also both debate about history. So couldn't you say the opposite and say, well, we both appealed to history, so let's look to scripture.
To just finish it off, because he sent in several, not these other distractions. I would love to hear more how Catholics claim truth was preserved as proven historically, as I do not simply trust the groupthink of medieval councils as much as prophets plus apostles. There we go.
So I would say that. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, is he wanting me to give an explanation for how we would say truth is preserved historically?
I'm not sure. Go ahead, Joe.
There was a lot, and there was pauses in between, so kind of hard to.
Here's my quick comment. Let me give mine real quick. Please. So Carden is right. What we see in the history is just what we see, and what we see is a group of bishops who were originally appointed by apostles. I don't doubt that, or at least a great number of them, coming together to try their best to sort out what the doctrines are. That's what the great councils were. They weren't led by divinely inspired revelation. It was people trying to figure it out. And in my mind, when you have a group of equals who are trying to figure things out, I think they'll do their best. Like I said, I agree with 95% of the Nicene Creed, for example. But it's an example of where you can have 95% right, but that 5% that you miss about the nature of God can cause some really big issues. So again, in my mind, the church doesn't get preserved through councils meeting, debating, and voting on things. You get it when you have a central authority that is divinely guided, which is what the Catholics claim, and which again is the reason that this all ultimately falls kind of in that.
Okay, I would say even in Acts 15 that the church comes together in council. So pitting central authority against councils is a false premise. So, Carden, to your question, you see vigorous debates over what things are true and appeals to what the apostles taught by people who knew them. There's a great example of this by Irenaeus and against Florian, or what's his name? I think that's his name. Another student of Polycarp's who had gone astray. So Polycarp learned Christianity from the apostle John, and Irenaeus learns it from Polycarp. This is what Marcus Bockmuehl calls living memory. that these guys aren't just reading in a book. They're not just reading in a history book or a Bible. They actually know from having learned from students of the apostles. So I think this is a very important thing. By the way, Marcus Bachmuel also has one of the best things on how creation ex nihilo exists in this period. It's called Creation Ex Nihilo in Palestinian Judaism and Early Christianity. So I'd recommend that as well, because he shows like the Dead Sea Scrolls. The idea this is coming from paganism is just completely false. Pagans actually believe the opposite. They believe the Mormon view that creation comes from a pre-existing matter. All that's to say, living memory is super important, that you have them defending what is true through orthodoxy by appealing to what the apostles had taught, even after the apostles are gone. And because so many people were taught by the apostles and their students, they're able to maintain a robust view. And this is preserved particularly in what were called the apostolic churches. You see this very clearly in Irenaeus in book 3, chapter 3. He talks about how we can know what the truth is. But it's just not a doctrinal free-for-all. There is a clear sense of what Ignatius and Irenaeus call the Catholic Church, and it has institutional continuity. It's not just a regional body. The whole reason it's Catholic is it is global. And sometimes that's the Bishop of Rome settling a doctrine. Other times it's the common consent that everybody who knew what the apostles taught know this certain thing to be true. If you go in there presupposing a Mormon ecclesiology, that it has to be top-down leadership by someone receiving ongoing revelation, it's going to be a very foreign picture. But that's a reason to doubt your presupposition, not a reason to think that, Jesus abandoned the church. Last 2 points. Jesus promises in John 14 and John 16 to send the Spirit of truth, who he promises will lead us into the fullness of truth. He actually says it is better for him to go because the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, will come. I think that points to the fact that we don't need to despair when Jesus goes into heaven or despair when the apostles die, because this Holy Spirit is the one guiding the church. And then 2, one of the ways that happens is this special role that the Bishop of Rome plays, and Irenaeus talks about it. He says it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church. That's not the only way orthodoxy is preserved, but it's a really important one. And so just as the apostles' authority and the Council of Jerusalem's authority coexists in Acts 15, the same is true of councils and the papacy in the early church.
Let's get to the super chat. If Jesus from Vita Vugax, okay. We've been going too long. If Jesus Christ founded a divinely guided church and it fell into an apostasy, why regard him as divinely authoritative rather than a failed first century charismatic figure?
Because I would say that his church didn't fall into apostasy in the sense of the body of believers. Just because the fullness of the institution isn't there doesn't mean that there are not still a Christian movement, even if that Christian movement is divided, as we see in history. So, one thing too, just important, councils, absolutely. I think councils are great, but councils are not sufficient. They're a great thing, but I think the point that Carden was trying to make was that councils don't determine the doctrine, and you do need a top-down ecclesiastical structure. That is the Catholic claim. So, and I believe the Catholic claim is correct for the reasons the Catholics give, that without a top-down central adjudicating authority, councils ultimately end up disputing amongst each other. And when people in the councils don't agree, as Joe said, denominationalism is the result of democratization of Christianity. And the structure of the church was never meant to be a democracy. Truth isn't determined by vote. And so ultimately you need some sort of a divinely guided central authority to prevent things from schism. I feel like I'm arguing like a Catholic today.
I'm not sure I understand your argument exactly. It sounds like you're saying church councils are not enough if somebody can just disagree with them and be exiled from the church or excommunicated or whatever. How is that different than the LDS model? Don't you have church councils and say which beliefs are? I mean, I'm thinking of like the September 6th
church councils ultimately, but
don't you excommunicate people who don't agree with your church's views?
No, you don't get excommunicated just because you disagree with the church. You can't publicly.
What about like the September 6th?
There are people that are excommunicated because they publicly go out and go against the church publicly. The Catholic Church obviously would do similar things to people who are engaging in public heresy, denouncing the Pope.
Sure, no, I'm not knocking the idea of excommunication. It sounded like you were. I've heard you repeatedly make this argument, like, "Oh, the councils. One of the ways we know they're no good is because they don't win over people by persuasion; they win it over by force, like excommunication."
No. That's not my argument. My argument would be something like this. If Cameron, if you want to just really quickly pop this this visual again, this is what a council looks like. If you want to pull up the slide here. This is what a council looks like. It's a group of equals, ultimately. Well, what happens when the equals disagree? Then you get the equalized structure problem where everyone kind of divides from one another. The brilliance of sort of the Catholic model of having this central ultimate authority is that you don't just have a council that ends up bickering and then dividing. You end up having, even if people break away, you have the central authority that still holds the entire thing together. And so that's why Catholics believe that the papacy is a necessary thing. And I agree. That's why, again, in the debate, I focus the debate on this ongoing centralized authority, because without it, I believe an apostasy is sort of inevitable.
All right, let's move on. So Randoms says LDS President Oakes in 2000 says modern apostles are not required to have seen him. We gain our witness the same way all members do. Then by what standard do they have apostolic authority?
Apostolic authority in the Church of Jesus Christ is something that is given by the laying on of hands by those who hold that authority. That's the way that our apostolic authority is passed on.
All right, let's get to this one. Question for Jacob.
Is that a shift? My understanding was that was a shift from prior Mormon teaching. Am I correct in that?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
There may have been people that have. There's nowhere in our scriptures that says that. Nothing canon. And I'm not aware of it being an official teaching anywhere that was a necessary
Was it at least
thing.
kind of a wise? I mean, it seems like if you're making a thing clarifying, oh yeah, we didn't actually see Jesus. That seems like you're dispelling some. The Pope has never had to.
Yeah, there have been people that have assumed that must be the case, and they were dispelling that.
Okay.
All right. I'm just going to keep powering through and putting some of these, again, because we're out of time, I'm just putting them on the screen. Don't even have time to really read them out because it would be a little bit unfair, but I just want to at least acknowledge that you guys have sent these in. Cactoid Jim sent in another one. There were about 100 years between Zechariah and Malachi. How long is too long? We've sort of already gone over that, so let's not get back into it. Gazalem says, God waited 1,700 years for Joseph Smith to restore his church only for scandals, polygamy, Kirtland, bank fraud, apostle excommunications, succession crisis, and splintered sects to taint it. Again, a little bit off topic, so we don't have to.
Yeah, one thing I want to make sure everyone understands is that I would still believe in the notion of the great apostasy, the idea that the central authority was lost, and then what resulted was doctrinal schism and or doctrinal drift and schism, just based off the history. If I were an atheist, I would still believe and make the arguments that I made. None of my arguments are predicated on Joseph Smith being a true prophet. Like
but
the history.
Would you say if you weren't
Smith.
LDS, you would believe Jesus meant to set up a perpetual institution and then it failed?
No, I would. I don't believe that the church failed. I believe that the institution was not. I would look at the history and say, look, this is simply what happened. What happened is that Jesus set up a central authority in Peter, as you persuasively argue in your book, and that office did not continue after him, and it was later assumed by the Bishop of Rome, and that is where the Catholic Church, with its identity centered in the existence of the papacy, kind of came into being. Was as the Bishop of Rome assumed that authority.
Sorry, I noticed it's only a $5 chat. He's cheap, but he's attacking my manhood, so I want to at least address this.
Who, Jonah Barnes? Is this the guy that was in your review stream, Jacob?
Oh
yeah. Where
this is him.
We talked.
Yeah,
yes.
Understanding
of
time
Cardin.
is as good as his argument. It has not been 3 hours soon. It is 2:19.
Yeah, it's been 2 hours. It's been 2 hours.
Going on is doing a lot of work. Yeah, I think you can attest to this, Jacob. I did offer a rematch when we thought the audio was really bad. and it was, understandably, it was busy for you since it was right before
I would
Christmas.
rather do this.
Yeah, I think this is better too, because also when there are ambiguities, we can clear them up in real time rather than having like pre-written 18-minute speeches and stuff. So hopefully people are getting something out of this. I think the sheer number of people who are involved is hopefully a testament to it. I really appreciate you being willing to do this for so long too.
Yeah, and I want everyone to know, like, the reason I'm doing this today, like, there were people who told me, like, don't do it, Jacob. Like, what if he gets a gotcha moment or something? It's like, dude, I don't care. Like, at the end of the day, I would rather have this conversation with you guys. Let's flesh this out. We still disagree. Yeah. And we're not going to agree at the end of this, obviously. But my hope is just this: by coming on and doing this and by explaining why I did the arguments I can do, I hope, if people may still think I'm wrong for a variety of reasons, but I hope people don't think that I was intentionally trying to be deceptive here.
Yeah, I would. Can I clarify?
You're a liar. You're a liar. Look at that face.
I said it felt dishonest to come on and change both the topic and the burden. I'm more or less convinced that the way you were thinking about the topic, where you could only imagine these two possibilities, that you imagine if you just disproved the papacy, that would prove your case. I still think you're shifting the burden, saying I've got the burden of proof to prove the opposite. But certainly in terms of the topic, it's clearer why you thought that was more topical than it was. So I'm willing to say, even though it felt like a complete out of left field, hey, you brought me in here to debate one thing and then this whole thing about the papacy, I at least see how you could come to that in good faith.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting question.
Hopefully that's progress.
I will say this hit me hard because both Trent has said this and you've said this. Trent said basically, if Catholicism is true, Mormonism is false. And
yeah, that's true.
If the papacy is true, then the great apostasy is false. So I did feel at a very minimum, I had to take I have to show that the papacy is not true as at a minimum standard. That was one of the ways that I viewed it.
I mean, yeah, if I don't know, Queen Elizabeth was married to George Bush, she would be, not a bachelorette. But that doesn't mean if you just disprove that she's married to George Bush, you've therefore proved she's a bachelorette. This is, again, the whole question of affirming the antecedent. This is a very common logical fallacy people make. And it works if there are literally only two options that could be true. But unless you assume that binary,
I do. And that's my point. From my perspective, I am making the case that those are the only two options on the table for the continual existence of the institution established in Peter, which is necessary to the church, that the only two options are either it existed or it didn't. Has a continual existence or it didn't.
And just be totally clear, if Catholicism is true, Mormonism is false. And conversely, if Mormonism is true, Catholicism is false. We can say that, but that doesn't mean that if we show the other one is false, that it makes ours true.
No,
like in
I
the same
agree.
way, like if I prove that there's a great apostasy, that doesn't prove Catholicism. If there wasn't, if you prove that there was, it doesn't prove Mormonism. All we've done is taken one option.
I never was attempting to prove Mormonism. See, that's one of the things I want to clarify. I was never attempting to prove Mormonism. I was trying to
I'm not attempting to prove Catholicism. That's what I'm saying.
And that's fine. What I would say, though, is that what I was trying to do in the debate and the way that it was framed was that I'm going to assume that Mormonism is false. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show from the history that there's no continual institution that exists, which is what the great apostasy functionally is.
One of the super chats earlier was like, this is just a great argument for Protestantism. I think Jacob, your argument is just not going to be convincing to anyone who is not a Catholic, at least in the debate, right? Because this is different.
Anyone who's not assuming certain Mormon premises, I would say.
Well, I would say
like you're arguing some of the downstream premises.
Well, what I'm arguing is the need for the central authority that Catholics also believe is necessary to have the fullness of the church. See that. To me,
I wish you would have done that in the debate. I wish you would have explicitly made that argument in the debate. I think that would have avoided a lot of the confusion. You would have had a tighter argument. It was sort of part of your strategy, but if you would have made that more explicit, and I think Jacob, honestly, just man to man, like I think this might be a learning experience for you to just be like, look, maybe next time I do need to make it a little bit more explicit and give the arguments to bridge the premises.
And maybe this is where I went wrong. I assumed that Catholics would have embraced that more fully, that Catholics would have been like, yeah, of course a central authority is needed. Like, I just kind of assumed that was going to be the case.
I think what they would go to is be
like, what do we mean by that? And what does that look like? That gets way too in the weeds. In the same way that if we said, like, again, if you're debating an atheist, you don't have to get in the weeds on all of the attributes of God or what religion is right about God. You can just say there is a God. Now we're ready to have the more specific conversation. So similarly, I would say that the case is there is a church. Now we can have the more specific conversation. Now that I think Catholicism is now in a very good position to show itself to be that church. But that is a second question that follows on the first. Did Jesus found a church that remains to this day? And then what is it? But you have to answer them kind of in that order.
Let's give Jacob the last thought here.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Even if you're talking about God, you have to define what you mean by God, right? What is the essential characteristics that, if you're going to talk about God, that God has to have, right? Otherwise, you can't really have an intelligible debate about it. In this case, we were talking about the church. And I was positing that an essential characteristic of the church is what Catholics and Latter-day Saints both agree on is necessary to have the fullness of the church, is that central authority. And so therefore, when other people are talking about the church, when Protestants talk about the church, they're not talking about the same thing on the institutional level. And so what I was saying is when you define church on an institutional level as needing this central authority, then the only question becomes, has that institutional authority always existed, or was it?
All right, let's move to this next question. This one I've sort of had myself. If the church committed apostasy, corrupted, what guarantees that the reestablished church won't do the same? That's one of the reasons why I left JW's. Mormonism faces the same challenge.
Yeah. So, is it possible? I believe, yes, it is possible that the church could fall into another apostasy. Do I think it will happen? No, because I believe in the promises given that it can't. Anytime human beings have agency, this gets into divine foreknowledge. This gets into the reasons that I'm an open theist. And I do believe that all prophecies are conditional ultimately.
Any thoughts, Joe? No? Cool. All right.
Well, I think that's revelatory. I don't want to say anything more to that. I think this is one of those areas where sometimes the more we talk, the more we have in common. Other times, the more we talk, the more we find it hard to build from that common ground. And I'm not saying that in any kind of accusatory way. That is just kind of the nature of any kind of debate or conversation of saying, like, okay, like maybe we don't even agree that, because I mean, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints claims it won't fall into apostasy. If you don't think that's true, that shifts kind of, I think, the expectations. Like usually when people are an apologist for a religion, they believe the claims of that religion to maybe a greater degree. I don't want to put words in your mouth, maybe a greater degree than you do on some of your views about fallibility.
Well, one thing is because we don't believe that is stated infallibly. We don't believe in an infallible teaching office. We have to always hold open the possibility that someone could be wrong about something. And so I believe that it's true. Like I believe that it is true that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will not fall into an apostasy. But when you're asking about logical possibilities, well, the only way I could say it's logically not possible, it's kind of like the Catholic saying it's logically impossible that the Marian dogmas are false because it's been stated infallibly. And you guys believe that when something is stated infallibly, it is impossible that it could be wrong. So that's one of the differences just with our doctrines of infallibility.
All right, that's where we're going to wrap things up. I think this has been helpful. I think in just clarifying things, and hopefully everyone can see that we're all still friends. Even though
I really appreciate doing this. I was a little nervous how this was going to go. And I'm very grateful. And Jacob, you're a huge part of it going as well as it did. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate that. I had a great time hanging out with you guys.
Likewise.
It was super fun to go sites and stuff.
I did, and I don't want this to get too personal. Did that thing that you were working on in the car, is that good now?
Yeah. Just so I had to take a doctor's appointment call with my daughter when we were together, Cameron and I, for some health stuff that she's going through, but things are good with that. So thanks for checking in on that. She's doing well,
Okay.
and no serious things going on with that. So we're very happy with how things went.
Wonderful.
Cool. Good to hear. All right, guys. Thank you guys for watching. I really do apologize. We weren't able to get to more super chats. Really appreciate it. At least we got them up on the screen for people to comment below.
I won't always say this. You guys should follow Cardin's example and specifically give huge donations to Catching Christianity. I said that was love for Cardin. He was a lot of fun to hang out with.
He was. All right, guys. Thanks for joining. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity.